had any knowledge of even basic tactics or strategy, certainly not enough to properly command the scores of men who manned the wall. But I knew when I was listening to him speak that this life was for me. Thorin's plan to find recruits at the tournament turned against him, however, as only a handful of noblemen went with him, with Benjen giving a promise to come as soon as he could. But nearly 36 of the servants at Harrenhal went with him to the wall, as the Night's Watch could never reject anyone who desired to take the Black, regardless of how many people they had manning the wall already. The criminals of the north continued to take the Black, and that was only pouring fuel onto a raging fire. The Night's Watch could barely sustain their present numbers, but they were constantly increasing, and now all the castles of the wall were full to the point that the builders were having to expand every castle on the wall with new barracks to house the new recruits, new smithies to forge more and more weapons and armor, and that meant more warehouses to store all the resources, more halls and kitchens to feed them, and more towers to watch over the castles as they grew, not to mention the builders who were working on his suggestion to put turntables beneath the catapults, scorpions and tread buckets on the top of the wall, so that they could be turned to fire at any attacking force with ease. At least we have no shortage of manpower to do all these things. I would never accept a knighthood, either, no matter what came with it. There are a few good knights in the world, men like Sir Barristan Selmy, but there are many more of them who are nothing more than animals. Sir Gregor Clegane is only one of many, I'm sure, he replied to the Royce. We have more in common than I might have thought. What is the point of having a title that means you should protect the weak and the innocent if so few knights follow the vows they swore? That's why I never accepted the knighthood. My father was stunned silent when he saw me refuse. Waymar laughed before his words become solemn and stern. But he was proud of me for doing so, I know it. I think he might even renounce his own knighthood, and he prayed in the godswood before I came north to take the Black. What made you volunteer, anyway? Not many from the south take the vows, we gain most of our strength from the north. I'm a third son. I had nothing to inherit, no lands, titles or gold of my own. I could have gone soldiering across the narrow sea, sign on with one of the mercenary companies, but the Night's Watch is a more honorable choice. You made the right choice. We have been needing more men who know how to command, how to lead other men into battle. We have thousands of brothers, but as brave as they are, only a handful of them know how to take charge of a dozen men going into battle. The blizzard grew more furious and hurled more and more snow against them, the bitter cold winds screaming as they rushed across the lands with a fierce roar, a cold that made him wince even behind armor and cloth, every breath he took filling his chest with pain, like the stabbing of 100 pinpricks. He opened his eyes against the winds, and saw for the briefest of moments the sun breaking through the thick clouds and shining against the snowflakes still falling, all of them glittering a brilliant white like the stars of the night sky as they drifted towards the ground, more beautiful than the finest of gemstones. Gods! Then, as soon as it had come, it was gone again, the warm sun retreating before the cold clouds, the light fading away back to a dull grey. He shifted as he looked back to his men, constantly wiggling his toes and fingers as he walked. Freezing to death was a slow and painless way to die, he knew, where it would feel as though his fingers and toes just felt as though they were never there at all, then his hands and feet, his arms and legs, and by the time it reached the chest it was always too late for help. Even if they managed to bring him back to Castle Black to warm up, the Maester and his stewards would have to take his arms and legs both. But what was the point of living when one could not run or walk or even crawl as a babe might, being nothing more than a chest and a head? No, they give them mercy, then, when their bodies have been so eaten by the cold. But so long as I can feel my fingers and toes, so long as I can feel them moving and aching, I know winter's hunger hasn't taken them just yet. These lands are more beautiful than anywhere else in Westeros, but they are deadly. Come on, we have to keep moving. No blizzard can keep this up for long, we don't want to be out in the open when the wildlings emerge from hiding. If only we had some elk. The free folk use them to move things, so should we. A horse would be useless in this weather. They hadn't been given any horses for this ranging, there were far less of them than there were rangers, and Thorin had been trying to track down one of the Ice River clans for nearly a month, tiring out their best steeds in the chase, so they were in the gift to rest. A tired horse north of the wall would be a dead horse before long, and any horse that died was very difficult to replace, so the watch had no choice but to be careful with them. It is one thing for the lords of the north to give us weapons, armor and food, another for them to give us war horses. The builders have plenty of cattle and oxen for their work, and the free folk have elk to carry their burdens, but we have to make do with nothing for this journey. Our stewards and builders are carrying our supplies, so my rangers can focus on fighting. In the distance, as the storm began to wither and die, were more trees of the haunted forest. It would be much harder to spot them amongst the trees, but it was also all that easier for them to be ambushed if the wildlings were already in waiting for them. But it is safer in the woods than in the opening. A Worgen and eagle could see us with ease, but in the trees it becomes much harder for them to find us. I would rather not get into a battle against them, not with so many builders and stewards here. My rangers could defeat 100 raiders without losing a man, but the stewards and builders aren't trained or armed for a battle. They would be slaughtered as soon as my men were busy fighting the wildlings. He sighed, his breath misting against the inside of the helmet. When they finally made it to the tree line, he breathed a sigh of relief. The tall sentinels, ironwoods and oaks were blocking most of the winds, giving his band of men a respite from their chilling bite, as well as making it much harder for them to be seen. Only a few more hours to go, and we will see if I was right. We will need to mark the spot on our maps so we can send out more men. We will probably need 100 rangers to defend while 500 builders set to work, with 300 stewards to feed them. He led the men onwards, through the thickest part of the woods, hoping that they would stretch from where he was all the way to the Milkwater so that they would not have to go out onto the snowy plains again. But as his companions spoke amongst themselves, he stayed quiet, listening out for any footsteps or anything else that could tell him the wildlings were about to attack. 7 hells, it's cold today. I never thought it could get colder up here, muttered one of the builders in complaint. Aye, coldest it has been in years, replied Guard, huddling himself together beneath his thick black cloak. Best for us to return to the wall before nightfall, it'll only get colder then. It gets this cold in the Vale come winter time. The mountains freeze and send tides of snow rolling to the bottom that can bury a knight on horseback whole, added Waymar. It gets even worse when the spring comes and the mountains thaw. Even more snow comes tumbling down the mountains, so much it can wipe out an entire village in a heartbeat. They must be buried under it. Gods, how do they get to the bodies? Asked another. When spring comes, the snow at the top of the mountains starts to melt, but at night it freezes again, big pieces as hard as stone and as big as a castle. There's nothing left to bury when they hit you. Some others just get buried in the snow further down the mountains, though. Crack. Benjen's sword hand went to his blade at the sound, the other a silent command to halt. Then he looked around. They were in a ditch between 2 rows of trees, an old stream long since frozen or dried up, cast in the shadows of the broad trees all around them, all of them big enough to hide a man or a woman on the other side. It was perfect for an ambush. His rangers were too spread out to protect everyone, even to protect each other. If there were enough wildlings, they might even be able to wipe out his group, he knew. But it will cost them. Waymar stepped towards him cautiously and slowly, fingering the pommel of his own steel as he asked as quietly as he could, his voice as low as the rasp of a blade leaving its scabbard. Are you sure you heard something? Willam took out his crossbow, looking along the sights carefully as Benjen replied. We're being watched. Waymar looked around, and then Benjen saw it. The glimmer of an iron arrowhead darting through the sky. It struck Waymar's breastplate above the heart, but that mattered little. The shaft cracked and broke as the iron bounced off, leaving only a scratch mark as the castle-forged steel rang like a bell. The arrowhead was blunted from the hit and shot into his left basaju, then it shattered in a storm of sparks and shards of iron. Ambush, he roared at the height of his voice, ripping his sword from its sheath as an entire clan's worth of wildlings poured into the ravine, not one of them carrying a weapon alike to any other. Some were armed with bone axes, others with ones made from stone, a few had bronze weapons and armor, rarer still were steel longswords stolen from the watch. His stewards and builders dove to the ground, letting the rangers fight without having to worry about striking down their brothers by accident, trying to avoid getting caught in the melee as his own men surged to fight the rising tide of screaming, shouting men and women. Willam's crossbow rang out with a loud twang as he shot down a man wearing bronze armor and furs, good armor for any wilderling, but against even a cheaply made crossbow he might as well have been naked. The bolt blew through his armor with ease, only the black fletching at the end sticking out from his chest as the lifeless body rolled down into the ditch. Another clansman rushed him with a hammer of stone, knowing that though he could not be killed with arrow or blade, a hammer could break his bones all the same. His mind was ablaze, not with fear or anger, but with a single question, burning over and over again into the foreground. Which clan is this? He swung low as Waymar charged against a spearwife, slamming into her with his shoulder and sending the woman crashing to the ground with a pained yell before running his blade through her belly. The wilderling dove back, just barely, so he pressed the attack, slashing sideways on the return swing, trying to put an end to the fight with the first hit. If he hits me with that hammer. For the watch. He ducked beneath the swing of the wilderling's stone hammer, the simple weapon nothing more than a hefty rock held together by sinews and sticks. Then, with a single cut, he cleaved across the wilderling's back and down the spine, feeling his blade slip through furs, bronze and bone. The man hadn't the life left to stagger or to cry, only to collapse to the ground like a mummer's puppet with the strings cut. He turned for the next enemy, one with a looted longsword, but it was clear he hadn't the knowledge to use it properly. Their blades locked against one another, and Benjen smiled behind his helm. Then he slammed his helmeted head against the bare-faced wilderling, a man with a beard that had just started to grow grey. He yelled out in pain as his nose crumpled and as steaming blood began to pour, but Benjen silenced him as the blade fell from the wilderling's hand with a single thrust through the heart, dislodging the body with a kick. He had been in 100 fights and only the most vicious wildlings were even close to being a match for him. He had trained at Winterfell from childhood under the watchful eye of the Master-at-Arms, sparring with his brothers and against the other children his age. His longsword was merely another part of his arm, the black plate armor protecting him a steel skin. Arrows rained down on him from above, but that's what they were, as harmless as against him and all his rangers. The Skagasi impaled another on his halberd before pulling it out and bringing the blade down upon their head, splitting fur, skin and skull the way a common man might split a log for firewood. Another stabbed at him from behind with a spear tipped with sharpened bone, hitting with enough force to knock loose a few scales, but not enough to stop him from killing them with a single blow of his mighty halberd. Then the wildlings started to run, dropping their weapons and fleeing just as he shoved another towards Waymar Royce's waiting blade, who dispatched them with his long sword so easily it was as if he was cutting through a round of freshly baked bread and not a man. He asked, looking over his men for wounds, "Is everyone all right?" "I have a scratch in my armor and nothing more," replied the Royce, raising his visor to wipe some sweat from his brow. "A fight can make men sweat even here." "Fine," added the Skagasi with a nod and a smile, wiping down his weapon with his cloak. Guard groaned, clutching at a cut across his left forearm. A steward quickly rushed over, tearing their cloak and wrapping it around as a bandage as his fellows tended to the rest of the wounded. But it was Willam who asked as he inspected his weapon, "What could make them attack us with such bad weapons? Normally they put up more of a fight than that." Willam's right, growled Guard, looking at his arm. "They were in a hurry to run. Foolish of them to attack us, too." The air went as cold as ice as a soft snow began to fall down on the group, the cry of the winds turning to a deathly silence. "Another group of wildlings, perhaps?" asked Waymar, sheathing his sword. "Might be, but they were in bronze," Benjen said, rolling over the body of one of the slain men with his boot to show the bronze scales he had sewn into his leathers. "These were warriors, not huntsmen. They'll have been in battle before, against other clans. They wouldn't run from them, not if it cost them everything they had." There was a loud rumbling of a charging animal, no, a dozen animals, coming towards them from behind, from the bright shining snows that made it impossible to see. He raised his visor to block the glare of the sun and squinted, and in the distance, he made out 15 white animals, the largest and most powerful in the center, all with riders, all with weapons, with a T-shaped banner of pitch black and a very complex snowflake sewn into it colored from a silvery dye that came only from the Reach, the crest given by the Night's Watch to the free folk people they trust as friends and allies. Any settlement flying it had the protection of the Watch and could call the Black Brothers to arms if they needed to, even being allowed to trade. But they had to provide help for any Black Brothers who asked for their help, even if it was something as simple as giving them shelter from a harsh blizzard or protecting them from another group. Both sides helped each other where they could, with the wargs of the Night's Watch being taught by those of the Free Folk in exchange for the help of the builders in building the Free Folk better homes and strong, sturdy stone walls to protect their villages. Our stewards tend to their wounds, just as their healers tend ours. He smiled as the group rode towards them, and as they got closer he could make out the lead rider. They were wearing all white, even a breastplate as white as the snows around them, a full helm, 2. Items that could only be made by the smiths of the Night's Watch, so it could only mean that this was someone they trusted more than any other, and he knew exactly who it was. His smile widened, though none of his brothers knew why, that was for certain. When the old Lord Went had held the great tournament at Harrenhal, he had been bewitched by the beautiful Alyssa Went, the fair maiden who truly deserved the title, the woman who had been crowned the Queen of Love and Beauty in the last great tourney in the realm, with long brown hair and chestnut eyes and the warmest smile he had ever seen and a kind, gentle heart. She had stunned him, and though his brothers had been busy with other things, he had been speaking with her the entire time, and she was happy to return his feelings. She had been saddened when she lost her title, and he had comforted her through the feast, and afterwards, into the early hours of the morning when she took him to her bedchambers, her muffled moans into his shoulder proved very well she had completely forgotten about the tournament. She had been the one woman who had nearly tempted him out of taking the black, and after he returned north the thought of accepting his father's offers of land and taking her as his wife had been even more tempting than ever before. And then came the rebellion. He had been separated from her by 1,000 miles of land and one of the largest wars Westeros had ever seen, but he had longed for her all the same, and when his brother returned at the end of the war to meet his wife with a babe of his own, Benjen had frozen with the thought that it was not his brother's son, but his own, conceived in the single night of passion between him and his beloved, even refusing to believe that it was Eddard's child for nearly an hour. Then the thought came back to him again, of marrying Alyssa and taking lands in the north. But he had been drowned with the grief after losing Lyanna, Brandon and their father, and then, when he was ready to choose, he found out Alyssa had died only a few months after the war's end, from a fall some said. But some think she died of a broken heart and hurled herself down those steps. He had started towards the wall the same day, nothing left to keep him in the north, nothing to stop him from fulfilling his promise to the Death Hand. The monstrous snow bears ran towards them only a little slower than a horse, but 1,000 times more dangerous. Her clan had learned how to tame them, how to use them as mounts without needing to use wargs to break the animals and cause them to hate men and women alike. Horns howled, as they rode towards them, and Waymar stepped beside him disbelieving. Those bears, they are huge, who are they? She's the queen beyond the wall, Waymar. Tormund might lead the wildlings, but she leads the free folk. He smiled again as the bears came to a halt in front of them, and then the leader took off her helmet, revealing her incredible beauty for all to see. She had a long braid of hair the same color as honey, and just as soft, he knew, with quicksilver gray eyes and sharp cheekbones that only added to her majestic beauty. She was born to be a queen, as regal as any woman he had seen, more so than any of the Targaryens he had seen at Harrenhal, for certain, a true warrior queen. She looked towards him, and he saw the slightest hint of a smile. "We meet again, Benjen. She knows you." Waymar whispered in surprise. "He has no idea." "A pleasure to see you again, too, Val." With a small move of her slender waist, the snow bear walked over to him, and when it was right in front of him, the bear looked at him curiously. Then it licked his face with its warm, rough tongue. He took a step backwards and laughed, as Val and all the others did, wiping his face with his cloak. "It seems she likes you, though I doubt she is the only one." Val looked around at the bodies behind them with a curious but steady eye. "Wildlings, this close to the wall. I thought they had been driven into the Frostfangs and Than. We know as little about them being so far south as you do." Benjen sighed. "They ambushed us." He saw a brief flash of concern on the Queen's face, "but we survived without a loss, only a few injuries. Best to burn the bodies of the dead if you can. We have heard rumors from some of the other clans further to the north." Benjen's blood ran cold. He trusted Val always, they were the closest of friends, even lovers once when he had saved her sister from a Shadowcat and broken a leg in the process, having to be tended to at the Fist while the rest of his ranging returned to the wall, leaving him alone with her and all the clans that followed her, some 1,000 men, women and children. She had stolen him that night. Even though he told her what his vows meant, he had certainly not tried to stop her from having her way with him. On the contrary, I helped her. He knew she would never lie to him about something like that, something that only meant, old Nan had told him the stories, about the ice devils that had come in the long night, the others riding their ice spiders and wielding blades so cold they could freeze a man's blood in his veins with a single strike, and the unliving wights that followed their masters into battle and plucked babes from the arms of their mothers to feast on their flesh. Without hesitation, He turned to his men and gave his orders. Find the wood for a funeral pyre. We'll burn all the bodies to ashes. Leave nothing. His men headed to carry out his commands, and Val gestured to the forests with the tip of her spear, ordering her protectors to help. Without a single complaint, her followers stepped into the woods with their bears, who were so big and strong a man could stand on the back of one and axe branches from the trees without the bear being bothered whatsoever. We were hunting with a group of your wargs, helping them practice on wild animals when one of them was in an eagle and saw your party in the snows. I had thought that you might have gotten lost, Ben. He smiled at her again. Every time she was around was always a pleasure. I never get lost, Val, you know that. Is that so? Then I suppose you must have stumbled into my cunt on purpose and not by accident. Val, he looked towards the men to see if she had been heard. You know a black brother is not supposed to do such things. She laughed, a beautiful sound for him. If they ever wonder what you were doing, simply tell them you were helping to improve relations between the Watch and my people. It would not be a lie, after all. He couldn't help but to laugh. No, I suppose it wouldn't be. How are things against Tormund? Giantsbane. You know as well as I that Thorin Deathhand is hunting him down with my wargs. It won't be long before he puts the Thunderfist down. The lands north of the wall were firmly divided between two groups, the Free Folk and the Wildlings. The Wildlings had Tormund Giantsbane as their king, the Free Folk had Val as their queen, and the Free Folk controlled everything from the wall north to the Antler River and west to the Frostfangs, with most of their people living in that area, perhaps 10 or 20,000 in total. They could work metals and were putting down the roots of permanent settlements, not like the Wildlings who would live in one place for a while before moving on to the next. The Fist of the First Men was where Val and her closest followers had made their home, restoring the old ring fort with the help of the builders to its former glory, and then some, as it was more like a castle now with a town, one that was very little more than a village, surrounding the walls with another wall on the outside to protect the people who settled there from Wilderling raiders. The Night's Watch trusted them enough to give them weapons and armor. Even if they weren't the best they had, they were still 100 times better than anything the Free Folk could make on their own. It was they who did most of the real fighting against the Wildlings, as they knew exactly how their old friends and now new enemies fought, where they liked to hide, everything about them that could help with defeating them, and now, with the weapons and numbers of the Night's Watch at their side, it was only a matter of time till the king beyond the wall was slain, and when that happened, the last of the Wildlings would likely submit to Val, and finally, there would be peace in the lands north of the wall. We can only hope so, Val. The Lord Commander wants to build a new fort and has put me in command of it. I was thinking of building it near the Fist. Truly. She smiled at him, a sweet smile, and for a moment he had completely forgotten about the oaths he swore before a heart tree and could only think about how she had smiled just the same when they had made love together for the first time, though he knew it was not meant to be. He was a brother of the Night's Watch and she a queen. I would like that. Even if you must pretend to have no interest in me, I would count you as one of my closest friends all the same. When the Giantsbane is finally slain, I will hold a feast at the Fist. I want you to be there, Ben. As a friend if not as my lover. Thank you, Val. You know we cannot be together, no matter how much we might want to, but my oaths don't stop me from being friends with you. He looked back and saw his men had assembled the funeral pyre and the snow bears were sinking their teeth into the bodies of the Wildlings before walking over to the pyre and dropping them onto the pile, crushing through bronze with ease as their riders trailed besides them, patting the bears that were as much their friends as they were their mounts before climbing back on and returning to Val's side. It was good to speak with you, Benjen. I must return to hunt, lest your walks get lost in the woods again. She smiled at him one last time before putting her helmet back on and leading her bear and all the others away. Gods, she is the prettiest woman in the 7 kingdoms, muttered Waymar once Val was away. In the world, Waymar. She is the most beautiful woman in the world. He sighed to himself in near silence at the thought of what his life might have been like with her had he not been a black brother. He would live with her, at the Fist, using all the things he had learned in his days at Winterfell to help her rule the land and bring it closer to the 7 kingdoms to the point that maybe, in the future, there wouldn't be a need for the Night's Watch anymore, or even a Lord Paramount beyond the wall and not a king or queen. They would have had children together, strong little boys and girls who would play together in the snow, laughing and teasing and having sons and daughters of their own when they were old enough. He lowered the faceplate of his helm as he walked over, taking a flint from his pocket and drawing his sword to strike it against. With a single flick the sparks shot onto the wood and took to flame, leaping from one piece of wood to the next, consuming the bodies with its hunger. And as he looked into the depths of the flames and thought of what could have been, a single cold tear rolled down his cheek. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 10. Notes. Oh boy, this part might have taken a while, but I hope it was worth the wait. The new ergonomic keyboard might be slowing me down a bit, but goddamn it drastically lowers the pain of long writing sessions when I am fully used to it and can sustain my maximum writing speed of 100 words a minute. I'll certainly be able to get a part like this out every single day, but that's still a while off yet. Anyway, in this part, we see the lands on the other side of the wall. The Night's Watch is stronger than it has been in a very long time, so powerful they have no choice but to start expanding into the lands beyond the wall, and that is the precise reason for Benjen's mission. They were there to find a good site to start construction of a new castle, so that the Watch could project its power into the haunted forest and beyond, making it easier for them to support their allies. Now, they are not meant to start work themselves, just to find the perfect site so that the builders can show up in force and get to work with a Ranger Free Folk escort. Benjen is going to be the commander of the fortress, by the decision of the Lord Commander. The Watch is a big organization now, with a lot of recruits from across the north, and for the most part they are either volunteers or low-level criminals, not killers and rapists. Even the Night's Watch has standards, and though they can never turn down anyone who is going to the wall, they can certainly deal with them, unofficially of course. It's not the Lord Commander keeping those kinds of people out of the Watch, but the common rank-and-file brothers who are. The Watch has strong relations with the free folk and do allow trade to pass through the wall to trade with them, even trading with the people at the Fist of the First Men themselves and giving them castle-forged weapons and armor to help in the war against the Raoul, savage wildlings. Val is seen as the perfect leader for the free folk by the Night's Watch, but it was not them who put her in charge. The free folk did. They like her a lot and follow her as their queen the same way the wildlings follow Tormund as their king. They are two separate groups and they hate each other as the wildlings raid the free folk and call them kneelers, while the free folk fight back and defend themselves and call the wildlings savages. The Watch is pouring all its strength into supporting the free folk, and because of that, the wildlings are getting crushed and driven further and further away from the wall, and closer to the lands of Always Winter. And some wildlings are more willing to stand and die than flee into the lands of Always Winter. Rumors are rumors, however, and no one knows for sure what is going on in that land of snow and ice and other things. Anyway, Benjen too has benefited greatly from the increased wealth of the Starks, in that he has a full suit of plate armor that he wears when he goes on a ranging, which means he is nigh invincible against most wildlings. They just don't have the metallurgy to be able to break through his armor, but they are a clever people and have come up with a few ideas of their own on how to get through such protection, like using something like a mace to break bones and kill a man that way. Like all the other Starks, Benjen has benefited from the increased wealth of the Starks, in that he has a full suit of plate that he wears while going on rangings, along with having more expensive training when it comes to swordsmanship. Rickard Stark spared no expense on any of his children, something Eddard has copied with his own, hence why old Benjenabe here just slaughtered several wildlings without breaking a sweat. He's got a ton of training to draw on, combined with a ton of actual battle experience. He won't go down easily and certainly not against wildlings with obsolete weapons and armor and no training and little experience in a head-on fight. Of course, he isn't invincible. Chapter 11, Rob 2. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Winterfell, a few days later. Rob took another spoonful of the golden honey, warmed to make it flow a little easier in the cold of the early morning, and drizzled it over his porridge, stirring it in before taking the first spoonful and washing it down with a cup of a good, dry ale cider. Today was the morning of the hunt, and if there was ever a reason to have a lighter breakfast it was the sighting of a great, strong stag in the woods. It would be the perfect afternoon meal, once they had managed to track it down, kill it and bring it back to Winterfell. The wonderful taste of slow-cooked venison easily worth saving plenty of space for, but more importantly he avoiding strong drink, Only the gods alone could know how much they would probably end up drinking while on the hunt, so that his mind could be as sharp as possible. Drinking too much fogged the mind, a dangerous thing on a hunt like this, even when surrounded by friends and family who would look out for him and keep him out of too much trouble, but it also dulled the senses and made it much harder to bag any game. And father is coming, too. He's been busy lately, so he's coming along to spend some time with his sons. But he looked down to the far end of the table, smiling at Alice Karstark. She looked beautiful today, with her long brown hair carefully brushed to perfection and wearing a good black and white riding dress that complemented her slender waist and hips, the white starburst of her family. She smiled back at him, her cheeks turning a light shade of red and her grey-blue eyes filled with loving warmth. He's not the only one coming along with us. Gods be good, she looks wonderful today. His sister Sansa enjoyed riding for fun, and where she led all the other ladies followed, just like him all the wolves. It was the natural order of things, and it meant that most of the maidens in Winterfell would be coming along with them for the day, though most of them were there only to ride and to talk and watch, not to hunt, with the exception of Daisy Mormont, and Arya, who was keen to try and bring back a prize of her own and prove to their mother that she was as good a hunter as any of them. She might as well be trying to storm Moat Cailin. All of his friends were going, but as he looked across the ladies' table, he couldn't find Wyler anywhere, even at her normal seat besides Lion. He swallowed as he turned to his half-brother and asked, "Jon, have you seen Wyler this morning?" His brother paused, his fork stuck in the greater half of a beef sausage. "No, I haven't. I don't think she's been outside of her chambers the whole morning." Torrhen Karstark leaned over, speaking a little quieter than the normal boisterous tones of their table. "She's still in bed, from what I know. Couldn't sleep the whole night. Maester Lewin's given her something to get her some rest." His brother Eddard looked over, and while his brother was distracted reached over with his fork, about to impale one of Torrhen's slices of bacon. Without even turning to face him, his brother spoke with a voice as cold as ice, "Touch my bacon and I will cut your heart out with a soup spoon." Eddard backed down, slumping back into his seat and focusing on his own plate as Robb and Jon laughed between themselves. "Last night was too warm," Robb said as he stirred his porridge more, trying to stop it from clumping together into a single ball of oats and sugar. "I can't blame her for wanting to get a little more rest. I could lay bricks with this." He took another spoonful as Donal Snowstock and the small Janumber, both sat opposite of one another just 3 chairs down the table, both of them wearing thick traveling leathers and both of them having muscles so large they wouldn't shame oxen, glared at one another, like two predators watching one another and waiting for the other to make the first move before they struck in turn, not even touching their plates or breaking their gaze as they stared into one another's eyes, daring the other to look away. They had never been enemies, certainly not, but they were rivals, as closely matched in strength and agility as Robb and Jon were. They naturally competed against one another in all things, from their practice fights against one another in the courtyard to hunting and feasting. Once, Donal had gone north with his kin, beyond the wall and into the haunted forest on a hunt only to return with the antlers of a strong elk brought down by his family, and in response the small Jon had gone with his father and uncles and returned with the entire head of a shadow cat, which he kept at his bedside as a trophy, if what Adra said was true. If they go out there again, they'll need to hunt others and ice dragons. "I will be the man to bring back the stag," said Donal, never breaking eye contact. The small Jon said nothing, and then he laughed. "You? The only thing you will be bringing back is a full quiver and a clean spear, not a stag." Donal turned red, but before he could reply the small Arto Swampstock, a man a year older than Robb yet not much bigger than Bran, said to both with a small smile, "Neither of you will be bringing back the stag, because while you two are fighting over who gets the kill, I'll have thrown my net, made the kill, brought it back, skinned it and made a cloak from the pelt." "Big words for such a small man," teased the Snowstock with a smile, finally turning away from the small Jon. "They are both cousins, but a Southron would have never guessed it." "Big words, aye, but only a fool would think there aren't advantages to being small and quick on my feet." The door to the great hall opened, and in stepped his younger brother Brandon, his vambrace of leather and banded iron fastened around his left arm and on it rested Goldwing, looking around curiously in utter silence. Without a word he threw his hand forward, and the bird shot across the room, diving on his plate upon the dais, snatching a sausage and looping around to his master in a single flight, all while Caitlin stared on in utter horror, about to say something before sighing and looking back at her plate in defeat, Ned saying something that made her smile again, till Brandon took the sausage from his bird, broke it in two and ate half for himself before giving Goldwing the other, smiling and laughing. As he did. He'll be hunting with his bird like usual, so he's going to get most of the smaller game. He's always been good at hunting squirrels and rabbits with Goldwing, but that bird has only ever gotten bigger and bigger. He could probably bring down a deer with it by now. Hunting in the north had always been more energetic and faster paced than in the south, if only because they had so much more ground to cover in so little time before sunset, which made things so much harder for them. So sometimes, they hunted from horseback instead of on foot, with lances like boar spears and hunting crossbows, ready to charge or shoot at the first sign of any prey, or ready to quickly flee if they encountered something they couldn't handle on their own, like a band of wilderling raiders. But no wilderling had made it south of the wall for over a century if what old Nan said was true. Even if they did make it over the wall, it'd be a death sentence for them to try and make it through the gift. But if they got here, it'd be easy for the 4 dozen of us to drive them off while hunting, even with us having to protect my sister and her friends. But this time, we'll be hunting on foot anyway, with a few men of the household guard around to look after our horses, since having too many steeds around would scare off the stag and the rest of the game. He turned to John, smiling. This is going to be a great hunt, I can feel it. I hope so, his brother replied. It'd be a waste for us to find nothing out there, but even still, it's fight night later. Years before, Roderick had made them practice fighting without weapons or armor, as if they had been caught in the midst of a drunken brawl or attacked on the way back to their chambers after a feast, meaning they had to defend themselves with their bare hands. But it had roots going back centuries, to the days of the kings of in the north and the competitions they held long before the Andals had crossed the narrow sea. Whereas the joust was the focus of an Andal tournament, in the lands of the first men, it was the melee that was considered to be the greater spectacle, with the winners getting far more glory and wealth than the winner of the joust. Any man was allowed to enter the melee, even if they had never fought before in their lives, since everyone was given the same weapons and armor. In those days, there had been 3 melees. The first was the same as the one seen at any great tournament, usually 10 sides of 10, for a total of 100 fighters against one another at the same time, but sometimes it was even larger on special occasions. The second was unarmed single combat, man against man in a circle placed before a heart tree, as no man would dare to be dishonest in full sight of the gods. They fought wearing only their breeches and with their only weapon their fists, feet and skill, a sport where a common lumberjack could do just as well as the son of a lord if the gods favored them more. It was in a match just like that when King Roderick Stark won against the King of the Iron Islands after an hour of non-stop fighting at a godswood on the western shore, taking so many blows to the head that it left his mind clouded for the rest of his life and his voice slurred. But the Kraken was even worse off, losing not just all memory of his sons and the ability to stand without something to support him, but Bear Island, too. The third type of the melee was the most dangerous, the mounted melee, where 50 men would face off against one another in a free-for-all, on horseback, a sport that was as bloody and dangerous as it was entertaining to watch. It had long since died out, never to come again, for good reasons in his opinion. It's hard to ride in the next tournament if you got maimed in the one you were just in, but the unarmed melee mostly died out after Aegon's conquest, but my grandfather brought it back, saying it'd be a good way to relieve tension. He always loved old traditions like that. Everyone knows it, but the Volantens have fighting arenas, too, just more dangerous ones. His uncle Brandon had a taste for the unarmed melee and was as fierce without a sword in his hands as he was with one. He proved that at Harrenhal, where he knocked out an anointed knight in front of half the realm after the Sir had said something his uncle had taken offense to, but Rob didn't know what. Father doesn't like to talk about the tourney at Harrenhal or the rebellion much, but Uncle Benjen told me about the fight. He grabbed him by the shoulder and just beat him senseless. There were still rules to the fights. There were to be not hits below the waist and above the knee, no eye gouging and no hitting a fallen opponent, but they were still dangerous, so Roderick only allowed them to do it for half an hour per man every fortnight, watching over every bout in person to make sure no lasting harm was done, while the common folk of the north had matches of their own in the taverns which the Snowcloaks turned a blind eye to, so long as both fighters were willing and no one was killed on purpose. The Night's Watch probably do it, too. I'd bet 10 silvers that Daisy will be there, Rob said between spoonfuls. double that if she takes part and another 10 that she wins. Jon laughed. What makes you so sure she'll be there? Arya's been wanting to go and watch the fights, but Mother's only letting her go if Daisy is by her to keep her out of too much trouble. I don't know if she'll actually fight though, I mean, she's been there 100 times before but never fought anyone. I think Arya will encourage her to get into a fight this time. She's as hard as Valyrian steel, she'll win if she fights someone her size. But if she fought you, he gave Jon a teasing smile, we'll have to find more room in the crypts. His brother turned red as he laughed. Everyone knew how embarrassed and shocked Daisy had been when he had abruptly walked across the courtyard and asked for her hand in marriage, without even telling her how he felt at any time before, so a fight between Jon and Daisy would be the perfect opportunity for her to get some vengeance, and what was more embarrassing for a man than being beaten by a woman? If an Andal knight got knocked out by the maiden he was meant to rescue, he'd probably kill himself afterwards. He had heard some of the older servants talk about how Daisy and Arya were just the same as Mage and Lyanna when they had been their age, since they acted the same, talked the same and even looked the same, with Daisy sometimes helping Arya to sneak out of the castle and teaching her how to fight, just as Mage did for Lyanna when she was the same age. If only my aunt was still alive, she would have loved to meet my sister. Once, when he and Jon were half their age, their father had told him how Robb had actually managed to worm his way out of Catelyn's grasp just long enough to grab hold of one of his aunt's fingers, for the first and only time before she was buried in the crypts of Winterfell. It was as if he wanted to be held by her, from what his father had told him, and his mother had nodded in agreement and said it was true, since he had been down in the crypt to see her, but he had been so young he couldn't remember any of it whatsoever, and knew the look of his aunt only from her statue in the crypts. He heard the familiar voice of his cunning and clever mentor, the free citizen Horono Veneris. If you are placing a bet on the fight, betting on Daisy would be a mistake. How come? Asked Jon. Any honorable man would refrain from hitting a woman, and when they must they would try to do as little harm as possible, said the free citizen carefully with a sly smile. So, assuming her foe chose to fight her, it means that they chose to fight against a woman. They have chosen to fight what others would believe to be dishonorable or unfair, and that tells you that they will not hold back. They have chosen a fight that they believe gives them the greatest advantage over their opponent. That's unfair, Robb said. Who would be so foul as to fight a woman only because she is easier to defeat than fighting a man? It is also very clever. Remember what I said about the perception of strength, Robb. If I was a betting man, I would choose him. Veneris gestured to Artos Swampstark with a nod of his head. People will underestimate him, think he is weak and easy to defeat because of his stature, and he knows this. All Crannog men know that they cannot win a frontal attack, so they strike wherever their foe is weakest. The Volanten's voice became one filled with respect. They know how to fight to their strengths and how to avoid their weaknesses. Come tonight, I believe you will learn that lesson well. Is there nothing this man doesn't know? Robb smiled towards the tiger. He had only known him for a handful of days, but it felt like he had learned so much from him already, and Robb knew that there was still so much more to learn. He had a fast and sharp mind and an excellent memory to go with it, but he was so clever it felt like there was not a single fox in the world that could even begin to match him. He's brilliant, I have so much to learn from him. When the time comes and I have sons of my own, I would gladly pay whatever price he asks to have him teach them, too. He was not the only person in Winterfell to count the Volanten tiger as a friend. Domeric had told him how he had tuned his harp and made the sound 100 times richer than it had been before, and it was common knowledge that many women, but surprisingly, not Adra, had been drawn towards his handsome and exotic looks, though he acknowledged their compliments and admiration with polite courtesy and nothing more. Out of curiosity, he asked, what do they hunt in Volantis? The free citizen laughed. Just about everything there is that lives under the sun. Most of the more powerful families have a menagerie of animals from across the entire world, for boasting, for showing to guests, and sometimes after a celebration they will let an animal out into the wild only to hunt it down for the last piece of sport before the guests go home. The greater the animal, the greater the prestige for hunting it down. Jon asked another question while Robb listened, content to eat his porridge. Next time, I think I will just have what everyone else has instead of trying to be clever. What happens to someone like me in Volantis? A bastard. Bastards in Volantis and in Valyria before the Doom were uncommon, to say the least. It is not because men and women do not lie with one another outside of marriage, they certainly do, but within the black walls the old Valyrian way of wedding brother to sister is alive and strong. Who is a bastard, then, if his mother and father were brother and sister, only that they were unwed? In Volantis and in Valyria before it, that child is considered but another part of the family, there is no such thing as having too many kin. But who would they marry if they don't have brothers or sisters? A simple question with a simple answer. They marry their mother or father in that case. Robb sputtered as he struggled to swallow his oats. Everyone in the Seven Kingdoms knew that the Dragon Lords had wed brother to sister even in the first days of the Freehold, with the Targaryens bringing the tradition to Westeros, but he had never once heard of how they would wed mother to son or father to daughter. That's even worse. The free citizen smiled. As you can imagine, that makes it very, very hard for a family to ever die out. So long as there is at least one member of the family left young enough to still make children, the family cannot die. For example, if every member of a family was wiped out in battle barring, say, a son, 6 and 10 years old, he would lie with a whore of the Valyrian look however long is needed to sire a daughter, then he would wed her at birth and wait for her to come of age. Sometimes, if two families are almost extinct, with only one daughter and one son left, they might couple with one another instead to make a son and a daughter to be married to their mother and father before leaving one another. That is how the Black Fyres managed to keep their line alive so long, even in exile. Maelys the Monstrous was the product of his father bedding a whore then bedding the resulting daughter after she came of age. He saw the obvious discomfort on the faces of Robb and Jon before continuing on a less horrifying topic. On the other hand, a man could expect to have up to 13 wives, so that when all is said and done, there are 14 people in the marriage, one for each of the flames and one for each of the gods. He laughed. That leaves very little time to have bastards, I assure you. If your father had that many wives, you must have 100 brothers and sisters. My father had only one wife. Since our family had fallen on hard times he uttered a quiet, sad sigh. As for siblings, I am the eldest of 11, with 5 brothers and 5 sisters. Robb pushed his empty bowl forward after nodding in understanding, finally finished with the mortar-like porridge. He wiped his mouth with a square napkin made from snow-white linen and embroidered with a grey direwolf, a fashion for dining that had managed to make the leap across the narrow sea. It had quickly spread across the north, as it was far more sightly and clean than just wiping on one's sleeve. He rose to his feet and was quickly followed by everyone else at his table, whether they were finished or not. I hadn't even gotten to my toast yet, muttered his brother. You could have waited a little longer. Come on, Jon, if we don't get riding soon the stag might run off. Already fully dressed for the hunt in his own riding leathers, he took his thick woolen traveling cloak from the wall, glancing towards the dais to see his father's solemn nod of approval before heading outside, into the bright light of the early morning. A thin snow struggled to come down, melting before it reached the ground, the perfect weather for a hunt, though if the snow started to come down thick and heavy, it would make things far more challenging and fun. Now we just need to wait for Daisy and... The Mormont woman rode past him, giving them all a teasing smile from atop her chestnut-brown hunter, a horse that had been born and raised on Bear Island. She was fully dressed for the hunt, holding her hunting spear with an experienced grip, her bow slung against her side and its quiver at her tip, the arrows fletched with black and green. How? She wasn't even in the Great Hall. How could they be mounted up and ready before us? Arya rode past on her own horse, dressed and equipped just as Daisy was, even making the same teasing smile. Daisy looked down to them all as Arya watched on with a proud smile. With how long you were all taking, Arya and I were starting to think we would have to go hunting by ourselves. They must have already ate. That's the only explanation. Robb sighed as an army of servants brought forth their steeds, hunting spears and bows and arrows, enough for every man in his group. Arya laughed as she urged her horse onwards, towards the gatehouse, as natural a rider as her aunt had been. He climbed atop his horse, following his littlest sister and Daisy towards the gatehouse, but going no further, not till his father was there to lead the way, while waiting for his sister and all her friends. He looked towards the tall and strong keep of Winterfell, to the place where Wyler was, and before he could think again he heard the free citizen again, far more serious than before, snowflakes melting in his silver hair. I made the same mistake, once the tiger said with a somber voice, following his gaze towards the keep before looking back towards him. What happened? I tried to love two different women and I paid the price by losing everything I ever cared for in the world. Rob, do not make the same mistake I did, pick one of them, love them and them alone. It had just been a silly idea anyway. My father would have never allowed me to be with both of them, and hells, they would have probably tried to kill each other if he did, or worse, they would try and kill each other's children so that theirs would inherit Winterfell. You should come hunting with us, Veneris. I could have one of the servants find you a spare horse and I would enjoy the talk, he said with a smile. Not today, but perhaps another time. I have much reading to do, since it is one thing to know the Volanthen interpretation of things and another to know the West AOC version. Some other time, then, and I'll remember what you said, don't worry. The tiger smiled before continuing on his way and leaving Rob surrounded by all his friends, but alone with his thoughts. All the riding in this hunt will give me time, and I've got a lot to think about. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 11. Chapter 12, Adra I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Near Winterfell, the 1st of March, 298 Aegon's conquest. Adra looked around with curious eyes as her horse carefully stepped across the rougher terrain of the forest floor, uninterested in the simple conversations of the boys as they tried so hard to find something to hunt. They were dismounted and on foot, but she and all the other ladies and the household guard escorting them were riding for the simple pleasure of being in the countryside. The north was as vast as the rest of the Seven Kingdoms put together, with mountains like the Vale and the Westerlands, wet rolling hills like the Stormlands and great rushing rivers like the Riverlands, though there was not a single desert or anything like one in the north. Only the desert devils in Dorne have those, but who cares about Dorne, these days? They are a faded power who will only get weaker and weaker as time goes on while the rest of the Seven Kingdoms grow more and more powerful. A blind man could see it. Theon walked alongside her, his bow in hand, smiling as he always did in her presence and looking around for prey, often in vain, since Brandon had already filled a game bag and was halfway through the second after catching a dozen hares, 8 squirrels and 2 foxes with his monstrous eagle. He is the man that will make me the Lady of the Iron Islands, even if he doesn't realize it yet. She flashed him a small smile, with the look in her eye that drove men wild. Some people tended to think of her as a harlot, a whore who spread her legs for any man, but in her veins coursed the blood of Lan the Clever and Brandon the Builder, great men who had created great dynasties that had stood the test of time with ease and became 2 of the greatest powers in Westeros, and she was far more cunning than most ever realized, except perhaps for her sweet, innocent little sister, who completely resembled her in body if not in mind or soul, who, as loyal and loving as ever, was content to stay quiet and not let people know of her thoughts and feelings. Years before, at the end of the Greyjoy Rebellion, she, her sister and her brother had all headed back to the Darkport to celebrate the victory with the rest of their family, and it was the day she had met her cousins, Jaime, Cersei and even the dwarf, Tyrion. It was a day of celebration of the victory of the Darkstarks and the Lannisters over the Greyjoys and the rest of the Iron Islands, a toast to the conquering heroes on both sides of the family, and a thanks from Lord Kevan for coming to their aid after the destruction of the Lannister fleet while it was still moored in port. Even her uncle Tywin was there, and though he had reputation for being ruthless and as cunning as any man could be, she thought that, perhaps, he had a gentler side somewhere within in his heart, the side that had won the affections of his beloved Joanna and cared so much for his eldest son that he taught him to properly read and write when the maester had long given up, or the man that had won the affections of the people of Lannisport who applauded him more than the king. A cruel man would never be so loved, or do such a thing as to help his son and his kin. He merely does whatever he has to do for the sake of his family, as I would do in his place. It was the first time she had met her cousins, and just as her brother Tiget looked up to Jaime Lannister, dreaming to be just as great a knight as he, she had seen Cersei Lannister, her cousin, her queen, and saw everything she ever wished to be. She had spent hours in admiration of the proud lioness, from the start of the feast, from when they were introduced to one another to the end of it, taking in everything she said with delight. The greatest weapon you could ever use is the one between your legs. The words echoed through her mind as they always had, the image of the golden lioness with her emerald eyes and wine glass in hand as strong as it had been when she had first seen them so long ago. No lesson the regal queen had taught her had sunk in deeper than it, and it had shaped her into the woman she was today, cunning and clever and seductive, able to bend a man to her will with a blink of her grey eyes, a smile and a sway of her hips. She had been blessed by the gods with beauty, though she knew she certainly wasn't the greatest in the realm, but like a boy practicing with their swords to become a deadly warrior, she had honed her skills in the art of charming men over the years, laying with them often, reading exotic tomes from across the narrow sea about the art of making love, even trying out entirely new ideas, and now, she could finish a man with 3 flicks of her wrists. The Greyjoy boy was proof enough of that. Now, men rushed to her bidding for the hope of a mere taste of the pleasure she could give them, and she had many friends in Winterfell's halls high and low who had been swayed by her charms without her once laying a finger on them. She could get almost anything she wanted for free and have people bring it to her. She could play men against one another with so much as a whisper, twist their loyalties as easy as wringing out a towel. And all that built up for one thing, Theon Greyjoy. Oh, she did like him for what he could be at the best of times, strong, confident and loving, but that was not the only reason she had set her sights upon him. No, it was to remove the one and only threat to the rest of her kin, Lannister, Stark and Darkstark. Before the war, before she had went to Winterfell, even, she had made friends with many of her father's guards, but first amongst them all was their captain, a young handsome man called Brandon. He was not noble of birth, but he was all the more so of heart, generous and friendly, even humble. Brandon was the uncle she had never had in her childhood. He had been taken alongside her father's host when it went to war against the traitors. He was the first of them off the ship, leading the charge against the defenders of one of the isles, and he was the first of them to die, his shoulder torn apart by a thrown axe that ripped open an artery and made him bleed to death in those forsaken sands. She and her sister had mourned and wept for him as if he truly was their uncle by blood, and she hoped to never again see another body covered by a Darkstark banner, not if she could ever help it again. But with everyone ahead of him in the succession killed by the war, my Theon will inherit the Iron Islands whenever his father dies, and I will be his wife, since he already has trouble finishing with any woman other than myself. I will ensure that the Iron Islands are never a threat to my family, to the North or the Westerlands ever again, even if I must rule them from the shadows or drive them into a ruin they could never recover from. I will never let another war happen, not if I can help it, but if I was wrong about Theon and he is mad enough to try and follow in his father's steps, well, I suppose one of our little Wolflians would be coming into their inheritance early, then. She concealed her sigh of disappointment with a breath. Were it not for how she desperately wished to keep the peace and stop the Ironborn from being a threat, she would have turned her eyes on the young heir to Winterfell, Robb. He is the man any grown lady with a thimbleful of sense would dream of marrying, healthy, strong and so very handsome, with a loving and honest heart, just like his father, and he is the heir to Winterfell and the North, too. Gods, what woman wouldn't want him just for that alone? His half-brother is certainly a pleasure to look at, too. Damn this weakness of mine. She had given her maidenhead to Theon years ago, so as to stroke the ego of the self-centered Greyjoy and make him all the more susceptible to her charms, but that night in the dark had not been the first time she had been close with someone, certainly not. There were many ways to be intimate with a man without having to have them slip inside her. My mother once told me that all my innocence had went into Lion when we shared the womb together. My little sister hasn't even kissed a boy yet, and here I am, 100 different men bedded. If the gods didn't want us to have sex, they should have never made us crave it or made it so damned fun. People like to think that only men want it, but they are lying to themselves if they think that's true. Their mother had once told her and Lion how surprised she had been when she had first came to Winterfell at the young age of 6 and 10, just wedded to a husband she thought she would grow to hate, not love, and one she planned on never sharing a bed with again if she had the choice. But when she arrived at the Dark Port, instead of seeing filthy shacks built all over haphazardly, flea-ridden wild dogs in the streets or a savage, fierce people of bare-chested barbarians only a little different than Dothraki screamers, no, what she saw was a small but wealthy port, thriving off the trade of the western shore of Westeros, with the roofs of many houses made from slate tiles, the streets the very image of peace and prosperity, and the people eager to meet the woman who was the bride of their lord's son. She said it reminded her of home. She laughed and Theon looked at her in confusion. My mother and father hate each other, but love each other, too, she explained. They both act the exact same, so sometimes they argue long and hard and other times, well, my sister and I had to come from somewhere. Theon laughed, her brother Tijet chuckled, and Lion blushed in silence. Suddenly, at the edge of her vision a single, small movement stood out, Something she knew could not have been caused by the low breeze or an illusion caused by her riding. No, this must have been caused by an animal. In silence, hoping to help Theon catch at least something in this hunt, she subtly pointed with a flick of her wrist and a glance of her eyes, and Theon saw it, as she knew he would. He's no fool. He might be self-centered and arrogant, but he is not a fool. A plump brown rabbit that had blended in perfectly with the forest around it till it had moved. Theon deftly drew an arrow from his bow without once breaking his gaze on his prey, knocked the black and gold-fletched arrow with an arm as steady as a statue's and let loose without even flinching. Then Goldwing shot down from the treetops, snatching the rabbit and gone again in the blink of an eye. The arrow struck the ground harmlessly where the rabbit's neck had once been. Brandon, his brothers and all the other boys laughed as the eagle circled around the trees and landed on his vambrace, offering the kill to Brandon, who took it and dropped it into his bag as his father watched on with a smile. "Gods be good, Bran, you should leave some for the rest of us," said Jon with a smile as Brandon closed his bag again. "If you keep this up, you will be the only one coming back with anything." "I wouldn't be surprised if he kills the stag with his eagle," added Robb, shifting an auburn hair from his eyes as he looked into the woods around them. "It can't be far. Bran, use Goldwing to find him for us, and give us a fighting chance." Bran smiled at his brothers as he threw his arm forward and allowed Goldwing to take flight once again, letting the great eagle soar past the leaves and branches into the sky high above, his mind half in the bird and half not, leaving his human body to walk alongside them like a ship sailing without a crew. It took months of long and dedicated practice for a walk to be able to control his human body at the same time as wearing a skin, yet alone to be aware of the events going on around both of them, and only the best walks could truly control both bodies at once as if there was no difference between them, and from there, the only place that more experience could take them was the amount of skins they could wear at one time. "When I go to the Iron Islands with Theon, I will need to take a few walks with me, then I will start filling the court with people who want peace, not warmongers and raiders. Most Ironborn would rather smash a door down than open it, so it'll be hard to find the people I want. But a few killings here, a bribe there, and everything will go as planned. Uncle Kevan will be so proud of me when everything is done, maybe Tywine, too. They will never have to worry about Lannisport or the Rock being attacked ever again. Oh. Maybe the Tyrells and the Redwynes will send me a wedding gift, since the Arbor might as well turn their fleet into wine racks. Theon, we should visit the capital sometime. I am sure Lord Stark could be persuaded to let you leave for a little time, so long as my family escorted you. It would let me have a chance to meet with Cersei again. She's everything I have always wanted to be. I've always wanted to try a girl with the Valyrian look, but Lord Stark would never let me leave," he answered with a sigh and a frown. "I'll only be allowed to leave when my father dies. He will probably be dead before long anyway. He might not go on many raids of his own anymore, but from what I know of how Pike is built, it's not the safest castle in a storm." "That's a shame. I'm sure Princess Myrcella would be smitten if she ever met you in person." "That is the encouragement for his ego, and now for the point, and it would be a great way for us to meet all the other men and women of the capital." Theon's eyes glowed with pride. "I'll ask him sometime, but not now." "As easy as ever, Theon." "Adra, you know our father wouldn't want us to leave the north," Adra spoke her sister quietly as she rode alongside her. "It's our home, and it's safe here." "But we can't stay at home forever, sweet sister," she said with a smile as she turned her attention to her twin sister. "Babies leave their cradles, young eagles leave the nest of their mother and father as they grow, even dragons leave the sides of their mothers as soon as they are big enough to fend for themselves in the world." "I didn't mean like that. I mean, we know the north, we know the sons of all the lords and ladies, we know if something goes wrong, we're not far from help, but if we went to the south..." "Come now, sister, there is nothing for either of us to be afraid of in the south. Lord Stark is King Robert's best friend, everyone knows that, just as everyone knows that the father wolf looks after all his pups just as much as the lioness does her cubs. If anyone tried to hurt us while we were away from the north, they wouldn't just have to fight Father, Tygg and the Darkport, but Winterfell and Casterly Rock, too." "You wouldn't need to get them involved," said their brother with a smile as he turned to face the both of them, walking backwards to keep pace with the other boys. "I'd rescue the both of you myself. See? Tygg wouldn't let anything happen to us." Lion smiled towards the brother they shared, one of the few men in the world she was comfortable being around. "Sometimes I wonder if she is just shy, or if she is truly scared of boys." She hardly ever leaves her room between lessons, and I haven't seen the inside of those walls since we first came to Winterfell. Still, I would rather stay in the north than go south, even if we would be there for only a little while." "Why?" she asked, curious to find where her sister's fear was coming from. Her sister gave her a small, shy smile. "Well, all my friends are here, in the north, like Sansa and Lady Stark. I like the cold, and really, why would I want to visit the south if everything I want is here, in the north? No, I'm happy here, with everything just as it is." If they had my sister's way of thinking, the first men would have never crossed the arm of Dawn. "Lie, if you act like that, when you're married, you won't ever have the chance to see the south unless your husband takes you there. You won't have the chance to see the free cities or the Titan of Bravos, even the High Tower. Don't you want to live your life a little, before being married?" Her sister shook her head and Adra blinked in silence. "My sister, gods, we might have the same body as one another, but she could never be more different from me. I'm happy with things just the way they are, Ada. I wouldn't think father would let either of you travel to King's Landing even if you wanted to." Tijet smiled. "It's too far and you haven't much reason to go. No, if you want to go south, you'll have to wait till Roderick goes with Joanna to Casterly Rock. He wants to show off how much she looks like her namesake. Jenna says she looks just like her, except Joanna's eyes are grey, not green." "Silver eyes and golden hair," Adra said with a smile. "Our niece will be one of the most beautiful women in the Seven Kingdoms when she's older, I'm sure of it. I wouldn't be surprised if she marries Rob's son, whenever he has one." She had once thought about putting an end to the back and forth game of small smiles, shy blushes and tender, pecking kisses that was being waged between Alis and Wyler, by luring Rob into her bedchamber and adding him to her list of conquests with a night he would never forget so long as he lived. Then all I would have to do is not drink my moon tea and have him think I might be pregnant. If that happens, he would marry me without a moment's doubt to avoid having a bastard of his own, I would bet, and his father would be proud of him for doing the right thing. Then I would have all the time in the world to make him never want to look at another woman ever again, without having to worry about having my prize stolen from me. Alis and Wyler aren't as clever as they think they are. They've placed the cart before the horse in this case, and Alis thinks she was so subtle. Wyler has Tansy poisoning, not that she would ever realize it. Once, not long after she had given Theon her maidenhead, she had drank nearly 5 cups of moon tea in a single day, drinking 1 cup after she finished a man as she started to learn how to refine her technique and become all the quicker at finishing someone, though she would be lying if she tried to say she didn't do it for her own enjoyment, too, and had nearly killed herself in the process. At first, it had been a simple headache, but it had quickly turned to paranoia as she saw things that were not there and daggers waiting in the shadows and at the end of her bed. Then it began to get even worse when she started to feel as hot as in an oven and then as cold as ice within seconds of each other, whilst her stomach churned in pain. It had perplexed Maester Lewin, and for a time he was ready to send a raven to the Darkport asking for her family to come to Winterfell, so that they could be there for her in case she took a turn for the worse. But she started to gain her strength again, and after extensive research, the Maester had found out that she had poisoned herself by taking far too much moon tea in far too little time, the tansy extract in each cup adding up to a dangerous amount. "That's why I only drink 1 cup a week, now, but he still thinks I might be hurting myself by drinking even that. He's afraid I might never be able to bear children because of how much I've drank over the years. I really hope not. I want to be a mother. I want to have little wolf pups and lion cubs that love me just as much as I love them. I want to hear them say my name and call me mother. I want to see them grow up into strong men and beautiful women with families of their own. I would rather die than birth a dead child." She swallowed. It was her greatest fear to feel a child kicking inside her, happy and healthy and strong, only for them to die on the way out of her without ever drawing their first breath or knowing the warmth of a mother's smile, or even worse, for them to die in her arms and let her feel the life that should have only just begun slip from her hands. It almost made her cry just thinking about it, but she hoped the gods old and new would spare her from having to experience such a nightmare. She breathed deeply and reassured herself. Her mother had never lost a child. She had difficult births, but Jenna had never lost a child to a stillbirth, and neither had Lady Stark or her cousin Cersei. They've never lost one, so why would I? I'm healthy, with good hips, so I should be fine, but gods, it scares me all the same. 7 hells. "Do you see how big that print is?" yelled one of Rob's friends in surprise, snapping her out of her thoughts. She urged her horse onwards to see in person as the other ladies shied away. "That's big for a stag's print," said another, a boy a little younger than Bran from one of the clans in the mountains. "I've never seen one that big." The other boys looked at him in disbelief, Rob shaking his head with an amused smile, without saying a word. "It's not a stag's print." The small Janumba crouched down beside it to take a closer look. "A stag has 2 toes, this has 4 and claws, too." "Aye, that's no stag," nodded Donal in agreement. "Wolf, by the looks of it." Adra looked down from her horse. It was a dog's track, definitely, but it was far larger than any footprint she had seen the largest dogs in Winterfell make, without a doubt. "That animal must be as big as my horse." Daisy walked over, bow in hands, and eagerly followed by Arya. "What kind of wolf makes a print that big?" "A direwolf," said the young Stark girl instinctively. "A direwolf is big enough to make that." They were as big as horses. Everything fell silent for far too long to be comfortable. It made sense, what else could have made a track that large? Everyone fell silent for far too long for it to have been comfortable. It makes sense. "A direwolf hasn't been seen south of the wall for 200 years, said Rob with amazement and a growing smile. "If it's out there, I want to find it." "Direwolves are dangerous," Rob cautioned the captain of the household guard, Jory Castle. "They went with their masters into battle and could rip armed and armored men apart." "My lord, we should return with the ladies to the castle as soon as possible and bring more men to drive it away, before it attacks anyone." Rob stared at the Jory in shock. "You mean you would hunt it down?" "The direwolf is our symbol, a symbol of the North." He looked straight to his father as he spoke. "Father, if Grandfather Ricard found out about a direwolf in the woods, what would he have done?" "He would have brought it back to Winterfell and paraded it through the streets so everyone could see it." Jon joined his brother in trying to convince their father. "If we could catch it, we would have a direwolf again, just like all the old Starks did. We write runes on our walls, we can speak the old tongue if we want, we have everything the old kingdom had and more, why not the wolves, too? If there's a real direwolf in these woods, I want to see it," said Daisy with a smile. "Just once. There are bears in every wood in Westeros, but a direwolf, they are special." Eddard turned to Jory and spoke with his lordly voice. "Jory, take the ladies back to Winterfell. We will finish the hunt, and if we can't find the direwolf you will bring Farlin and his hounds so we might run it off." "Yes, my lord," was all the captain replied as he bowed before his liege lord and left to carry out his bidding, ordering the bulk of his men to mount their steeds and to form up alongside Sansa and her ladies. Adra waved to her brother with a smile, and blew a kiss to Theon to keep him warm while she was away, then she turned her horse about and rode alongside her friends. "And you, Arya?" insisted her father. "But I want to hunt with you." Her father crouched down to look Arya in the eyes and smiled, his lordly voice and face replaced by that of a loving father. "There'll be other hunts, Arya. I promise, I'll never stop you from going on them when you are older, but a direwolf is dangerous, too dangerous for you to stay here." Daisy smiled at Arya. "Your father's right. There'll be other hunts, and a direwolf is too dangerous for you when you're still so young," she laughed. "Even I wouldn't try to find one when I was your age. But, the hunt. The wolf. If you drive it away, I'll never get a chance to see one." Daisy looked to Eddard and said, "If I stay by her, she should be fine. I can show her how to hunt without getting herself hurt. I promise, I'll keep her safe." Eddard looked at Daisy for a moment before sighing, smiling and nodding. He mussed Arya's hair as she laughed. "Not a word of this to your mother." "Not a word," swore Arya with a smile, taking her place beside Daisy again, both of them holding their bows almost the exact same way. Sansa waved to Domeric, Alis waved to Rob and all the other ladies followed by waving to the men they were interested in, but Sister simply did what was proper and waved to everyone for as little as she could before putting her arm at her side again. "I shouldn't be surprised by her, but I am. How could a woman be so afraid of boys?" She sighed as looked out of the forest, across the green plains, covered with a light, patchy snow that had already started to melt, leading her horse onwards. "My sister is hopeless," she muttered to Sansa sadly. "I wouldn't be surprised if she would rather kill herself than get married." "Give her time," said the Stark girl with a smile, as sure of what she was saying as ever. She'll find someone who makes her happy eventually. How can you be so sure? She is afraid of boys. Sansa looked at her as she began, remember when Rickon was scared of spiders? He screamed till your mother arrived, I remember. Who wouldn't remember that? He sounded like he was being murdered. Remember that a week later, we saw him playing in the Godswood and he reached into the tree's eye, pulled out a handful of spiders and ate them. Adra laughed. He fisted a handful of them into his mouth as if they were sweets. I don't think he'll ever do that again, gods. He licked the tree sap to get the taste out of his mouth. Sansa continued with another smile, you never know what might happen tomorrow. For all we know, she might fall in love with someone at dinner tonight or tomorrow. I wouldn't worry about her, she'll find someone who makes her happy eventually. I hope so, Sansa, I really hope so. She sighed, and then there was the shouting of men and the sounds of a dozen bows shooting off in fast succession, one right after another, and a shout of pain and the loudest, deepest bark she had ever heard a wolf make. Oh gods, TYGG. She spun her horse around as fast as she could, stabbing her heels into its side, but Sansa was already ahead. Jory yelled as he drew his sword, my lady. Come back. We cannot protect. Protect me by following, damn you. Sansa shouted back in open defiance, urging her horse into a gallop back to the clearing where they had been only a few minutes before. Adra followed as quickly as she could, hoping and praying nothing had gone wrong with the hunt, that her brother was safe and sound, that Theon was alive and well and utterly unharmed. The clearing was utter chaos, dead game animals littered the ground like fallen leaves, scent flying from the tattered remains of Brandon's second game bag, the iron stench of blood rising from everywhere around her and filling the air with its metal taste. A stag lay dead, no more than 20 feet from where she had been sat upon her horse before, arrows rising from its side from head to haunch like a meadow of blooming wildflowers as blood still spurt from where its throat had once been. Theon nursed a broken nose as blood streamed down his face. Robb glanced at his broken knuckles as they started to swell, looking towards the Greyjoy with disdain and almost growling at him as he flexed his fingers again. If you had shot the direwolf, I would have shot you, he said with a low, angry voice. And if you had hit Arya, I would beat you to death with my own hands. Easy, Robb, he didn't mean to, he just tried to keep her safe, is all, soothed his bastard brother. Everything came out fine, anyway, other than your hand and his face. Is she going to be alright? Asked Arya from behind her. Adra turned in her saddle, and a chill went down her spine as she saw it. The direwolf, as grey as a storm cloud and so tall it looked her in the eye as blood flowed from a piece of broken antler buried in the shoulder. Gods. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 12. Notes. Now, just to get it out of the way, we'll have a POV of what happened in the clearing while Adra and Sansa weren't there, so you can see exactly what happened. Anyway, as you can see, Adra is far more clever than she appears to be, that's for sure. She really looks up to the two main sides of the family, the Starks and the Lannisters, and is sort of a hybrid of both. She would do anything for her family, and she would say she has the cunning of a Lannister, too, and she utterly adores Cersei Lannister. She's everything Adra wants to be in the world, and by thinking that of her and letting Cersei know it, well, it means she only ever sees the good parts of Cersei and not the bad. The Darkstarks generally maintain good relations with their Lannister cousins, just as they do with Winterfell, and all of the Darkstark children have met their Lannister cousins, barring Benjen and Joanna Darkstark, the two youngest members and the children of the Darkstark heir. Tywin is happy to keep the friendship good. There's a tool for every task, and a task for every tool, because of things like the Greyjoy Rebellion and before that, the Rain Tarbeck one where the Darkstarks were ready to come aid the Lannisters if needed. Tijet Darkstark is, well, it should be quite clear who he is named for, and he looks up to Jaime in the same way that Adra looks up to Cersei. Though he still doesn't know about why Jaime killed Aerys, TYGG simply believes it was for a good reason and that Jaime shouldn't be blamed for killing a raving, tyrannical madman. Adra hopes to be just as successful as Cersei, but she also wants to keep her family as safe as possible, so she's hoping to wed Theon Greyjoy so as to remove the only threat to her family. She does have a soft side for Theon for when he's at his best. Her cunning side is definitely encouraging the relationship to proceed. She's taking control of his love life because of what Cersei said, though Adra might be taking it in a different direction than Cersei had meant by using her lady parts as a tool of pleasure rather than a weapon of seduction. Chapter 13, Bran 2. Notes. Right, so after the combined delays of losing the part, having to finish the Greystock family tree and almost losing my home, here we are again. The first part isn't exactly as I originally wrote it and so might be a little rough around the edges, but after that point things should start clearing themselves up, laughing smiley. And, I slipped a small reference into the first paragraph, tongue poking smiley. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Bran smiled as his body walked along the forest floor, all the while his mind was in the eagle soaring in the skies high above, looking down on his body and all his friends as he circled around, watching for any sign of more prey to hunt, great or small, and most importantly, looking for the direwolf and the stag. He could hear the voices of all those talking around him, but it was like hearing them speaking from the bottom of a pond, almost every word distorted and utterly unintelligible, though a few words he knew well, names of his friends and places he had been to, sometimes bled through, though it was impossible to make any sense of what they were talking about. Only walks with years of experience could be in both bodies at the same time, and even then they couldn't pay as much attention to the happenings around them as those who weren't trying to be in both. But the very best walks could be in more than one body at once, influencing and guiding all of their skins at the same time, but only a handful of walks with that level of power were born in every generation, even counting the ones beyond the wall. But legend had it that green seers could assume direct control over all of their skins at the same time, as if they were as much a part of their body as their arms and legs were. But that's just a legend, old Nan told me. I asked a green man about it and he said that only the children of the forest could do it. Goldwing allowed him to take full control of his body, so he brought him lower, through the thick green leaves to rest upon a branch, his sharp talons digging into the bark as he looked around again, hoping to get a better look, and saw Robb walk over to his side. Bran, he said, his voice half muddled and half clear. He blinked as he felt his brother's hand upon his shoulder, leaving Goldwing's body and returning to his own. His brother smiled and asked, "Did you see anything?" Bran shook his head, looking past his brother to see his bird looking straight towards him before turning his eyes back to Robb. "No, there are too many trees." "That didn't seem to stop you from catching everything in the forest," said Jon from across the clearing. "The stag and the direwolf are probably the only things in the woods other than us, now." He laughed with his brothers, smiling. He loved to go hunting, especially with Goldwing at his side and friends all around. It was never much of a challenge for anyone blessed enough to be a walk to bring back plenty of game, even if they rarely ever used the ability and had little experience with it. "But the more I practice, the better I get. Mother doesn't like me warging into Goldwing, but I don't think it's any different than putting on armor, really." He had always dreamed of being named to the Kingsguard, and being one of the greatest trackers in the Seven Kingdoms could only ever make it more likely for him to be given a white cloak at the next opening, even more so if he had a retinue of animals to help guard the king and his family whenever they were out of the capital, like whenever Robert was on one of the hunts he loved so much. "When I'm in the Kingsguard, we'll be hunting in the Kingswood a lot together, so the better I am at hunting, the more the king will like me." He hoped for the chance to show King Robert and his family how good he was with the lance, the sword and his power to walk, but more than anything else in the world he dreamed of being the squire to the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Barristan Selmy himself. There was no doubt in his heart that Sir Barristan Selmy was the greatest warrior of their age and the only member of Aes Kingsguard to swear fealty to King Robert at the end of the rebellion. He was the living legend who had forever put an end to the Blackfyr threat upon the Stepstones after slaying Maelys Blackfyr in single combat, but that was only one of his many achievements. Every day and night he prayed to gods old and new for King Robert to come to Winterfell and let him have that opportunity to prove himself. His father had offered to find him a good marriage and give him some land to build a keep on, but he had no interest in them, so he turned them down and focused all the more on his dream of being the very first Stark to wear a white cloak. He could even be the first member of the Kingsguard to not be a knight, too, since he was unsure if he wanted to wear the title or not. Like most Northmen, he knew that many of the knights in the south were just cold-blooded killers like the Ironborn except with a Sir before their name, like Sir Amory Lorque and Sir Gregor Clegane, both of whom had butchered innocent and defenseless children when King's Landing fell, not just the royal children, but the families of the Targaryen's own household guard and servants who had been in the Red Keep when it had been sacked. Knights are meant to be honorable and they swear to defend the weak and the helpless, but Sir Gregor killed a baby. Not all knights are like him though, right? Sabaristan would never hurt a baby. No true knight would ever hurt a baby, even if they were ordered to. Be careful, said their father as he looked around, holding his own hunting bow as he did. If we find the direwolf, you must stay away from it and make no sudden moves, else it might think you are a threat. Theon walked by, holding his own bow tight and having his other hand close to the quiver he kept at his hip. The Ironborn had few things he could be proud of, but one of them was his skills with a bow, since he was easily the best archer Bran had ever seen, a better shot than anyone in the castle's garrison, rarely ever missing even though he shot twice as fast as anyone else in the castle, letting his arrows loose without even taking any time to aim first. I hope I get that good with the bow one day, even though I don't have to be. He was good with a sword, better with a lance and terrible with a bow, since it seemed his arrows had a will all of their own. But being a warg and having an eagle meant he never had to hunt with a bow, and the armies of the north preferred to use crossbows, so there was no real need for him to know how to shoot a bow well other than for the prestige of it, but being a good archer would make sure he got his place in the Kingsguard. How dangerous could a grown direwolf be, asked Theon. It would only take one arrow to the throat to bring it down. His father looked at Theon with stern eyes, just as all those with direwolves above their hearts glared at him with disgust. A direwolf only a year old could kill a dozen men in armor, Theon. The kings in the north used to ride into battle with their direwolves besides them, and even without armor they could take dozens of arrows before falling. Theon was silent and unwilling to reply, knowing that all eyes were on him and that whatever he said next would probably be held against him if he made even the slightest mistake. Instead he sighed and looked towards the floor, kicking a rock on the ground as he did, and instantly Bran couldn't help but feel sorry for the Greyjoy heir. Here he was, miles away from home, with no friends nor family around him and surrounded by a people who saw him as a nuisance, all but Adra, who loved him, and everyone else at Winterfell, or so it seemed. He would try and run away if he ever had the chance, but the wargs would find him before he could get too far away. While most of the other wards went back to their homes for feasts, name-a-days and other such things like that, Theon would only be allowed to leave Winterfell once his father had died, so that he could return to the Iron Islands and take over. But Bran thought they might have been making a mistake by not being friends with him. When Theon inherited the Iron Islands from his father, he would remember everything that had ever happened to him at Winterfell, and who knew how he would act then. We should start being nicer to Theon, he said to Robb as they walked along. He doesn't have any brothers anymore. He is all alone, isn't he? Robb looked towards the Greyjoy and saw him standing in the center of the group all on his own before sighing. I'll give him a chance. Robb walked over to Theon on the far side of the group, muttering something under his breath as Arya laughed at one of Daisy's japes. His sister and Daisy Mormont were as utterly inseparable as Robb and Jon, never being far from one another except for the times when Arya managed to sneak her way out of the castle and into the city, but even then it was Daisy who brought her back more often than not. She knew exactly how Arya thought and where she wanted to go, so whilst it could take the guards of Winterfell and the Snowcloaks from sunrise to sunset to track her down, even with the help their wargs, Daisy could usually find her in an hour, but she would spend the entire day with her wandering the city before bringing her back in time for dinner. Everyone in the castle knew that Arya wanted to visit Bear Island one day and meet of all of Daisy's sisters and nieces, to go there whenever her friend went back for one of her family's feasts. But Catelyn was reluctant to let her go, even though she was friends with Jorah's wife, simply because there was the chance that Arya wouldn't want to go home again afterwards and would ask to stay there as a ward. That wouldn't happen, though, since Arya would follow Daisy back to Winterfell. He smiled towards his sister and her friend, and then he felt Goldwing nudge at his mind with concern, seeing it a second before he had the chance to see it for himself. Then there it was. The direwolf was standing only a few feet from his sister, as grey as a summer's storm and as large as a horse, yet he was sure he was the only one to have noticed it. The direwolf sniffed the air and looked around with concern, seeing him and all the others as they walked along before turning around to flee, and he smiled and reached out, not with the force that a warg might use to take an animal, or the familiar way he might slip into Goldwing, but with a slower, gentler approach like the one a man might use to calm his horse or a mother trying to lull her babe to sleep. Instantly, the direwolf looked towards the group, towards him, and he felt no anger or hatred for his intrusion, but fear of being hurt by him and all the others, fear of being hunted by those things that were meant to be dead but weren't, fear for the pups she was carrying inside her. Don't be afraid, he soothed, trying to reassure the Schwolf. We won't hurt you. The direwolf took a hesitant step towards them as he felt her fear being replaced by the hope that he and all the others could help keep her safe, or at the very least that they would do no harm to her. He heard his sister gasp when she noticed the direwolf, Daisy pulling her sister back to keep her safe, and then he felt another rush of concern go through the direwolf as she pushed him away and made everything a blur. He heard Theon shout a word and saw him go through the movements of knocking an arrow, only for Rob to swing at him with all the strength he had as the bow sang its deadly tune. He heard the direwolf yelp from the attack, only to feel no pain as it flew past harmlessly. Then he heard a rush of hooves as something big and brown charged past him, an antler ripping into the game bag he had slung across his shoulder, tearing the cloth apart and scattering the contents in an explosion of dead game as his mind rushed back to the foreground, his eyes focusing again, as the stag charged across the clearing towards the direwolf, forced forwards by all the momentum of its movement. An arrow with a fletching of white and grey shot into its haunch, and then there was the music of 100 bows setting 100 arrows loose at the same time, carrying the colours of every house in the north as they punched into the stag's side, some few slipping through the gaps between ribs to hit the organs within, others having so much force behind them as to break bones. But the stag's momentum carried it forward even as its legs began to give way and as crimson tears poured from its wounds, giving the direwolf, slowed by the swell of its middle and the weight of those within, no time to escape the path of its charge, but enough to ensure its pups would live. He felt a tingle of pain against his shoulder as a resounding crack and a yelp echoed through the woods, the stag's left antler shattering from the force of its charge as it collapsed to the ground against the direwolf. The Schwulf snarled furiously at the dying stag, and in the time it took for his heart to beat again he saw her lock her jaws around the stag's throat and rip it out in a rush of blood so hot it steamed in the cold air, the smell so strong it filled the entire clearing and the flavor so powerful he could taste nothing but iron washing over his mouth for just a second as the bond between man and wolf broke completely. Theon snatched at his nose as blood began to stream down his face from where Rob had struck him as all the women of their party returned to them, led by his eldest sister and Jory, who drew his sword as he looked around to make sure there was no longer a threat. "If you had shot the direwolf, I would have shot you," Rob said as his pack closed in around him, "and if you had hit Arya, I would beat you to death with my own hands." "Easy, Rob, he didn't mean to, he just tried to keep her safe," is all said their bastard brother, trying to calm the two of them down before more harm was done. "Everything came out fine, anyway, other than your hand and his face." Arya slowly stepped towards the direwolf even as Daisy quietly tried to keep her away from it for her own good, but his sister's wide smile turned to a look of concern as she saw the she-wolf's blood-matted fur, and she looked directly to their father. "Is she going to be all right?" All eyes turned towards the Lord of Winterfell as conversations died and everyone waited for his next order, and it was as clear as a sunny summer's day what he was thinking about in that moment of silence: what to do with the wolf. A direwolf was one of the most dangerous animals in the world when cornered or angered, as deadly as a snow bear and twice as fast, and even more so when inside a building. If she chose to attack them after they brought her under their roof, she could very well kill or maim someone before they would even have a chance to stop her. But on the other hand, she was wounded, pregnant and tired from her journeys and day without food, so she stood no chance of making it past the week's end on her own. Finally, he sighed and drew his dagger as he walked towards the direwolf, and as Bran's blood turned to ice water at the sight of the bared steel. "Arya, stay where you are. Jory, come here. Don't hurt her," screamed his sister as Rob and Jon rushed over to try and reason with him. Then both of his brothers stopped down in their tracks when Eddard unclasped his cloak and cut 2 pieces from the thick cloth. "I would never hurt her," said their father with a smile as the Schwulf licked his fingers. "She's of the north." Jory took one of the 2 pieces of cloth from his father's hands and pressed it against the direwolf's shoulder, just below where the antler had embedded itself. The men of the household guard gathered around the two of them, ready to keep their lord safe if the direwolf reacted badly, but he could hear some of them whispering amongst themselves about how the direwolf was the first to be seen in the north in centuries and how it might have been killed had it not been for their hunting party shooting the stag down. With his back turned to his sons, Eddard placed his hand on the part of the antler closest to the wolf's body, flexing his fingers to be sure his grip was good and would not slip on the smooth antler or in the warm blood, the white and grey arrows of his quiver jostling around for empty space where there had once been another. Then, with a single fast motion, Eddard pulled the antler out and the Schwulf cried out from the pain, louder than the largest of Winterfell's dogs or any wolf he had ever heard howling in the night before. The grey cloth of his father's cloak turned a bright scarlet as it soaked up the spurting blood, But after a minute of utter silence where no one so much as uttered a single word, too busy watching the wolf and uttering silent prayers to the gods, Jory took the blood-soaked rag away and Ned wrapped the second rag around the dire wolf's shoulder as best as he could, trying to keep the dirt out of the wound and to slow or stop the bleeding until they could get back to Winterfell. Every man who had ever went to war learned how to bandage a wound, most even learning how to clean one and how to burn it shut without doing more harm than good, or how to mend their own weapons and armor and make them last long enough for a blacksmith to be able to do proper repairs, and his father was no exception. A youth spent in the mountains of the Vale with Robert Baratheon before going on campaign in the rebellion had seen to that. His father threw the antler to the side, and no one paid any attention to the still warm body of the stag. The Schwulf slowly limped towards Eddard's side, growing more confident with every step it took till its steps became something close to normalcy, only a small patch of red in the center of the bandage. Robb, Jon and all the others smiled and walked over, taking a closer look, and he couldn't help himself but to follow them. She was huge, not just with pups but with muscle, too, as big as a full-grown pony and heavier, too, with great golden eyes that looked at everyone with curiosity, and no small amount of caution, he knew. She knows we mean her no harm. Just as he had reached into her mind and felt her feelings of fear and apprehension when he tried to comfort her with his powers, she had been able to learn that he and all the others would never hurt her, so long as she didn't harm any of them. Robb reached out to touch her, to make sure what his eyes were telling him was true, and she licked his fingers, just as she did to Jon, Sansa and everyone else who had Stark blood coursing through their veins. Only Lyra Greystoke stayed away, the youngest of all those who had gone riding, still mounted on her horse, looking down on the direwolf with sad eyes and an obvious desire to join all the others besides the direwolf, but she wouldn't let herself dismount from her horse, even though no one would have stopped her or scolded her for wanting to join the others besides the wolf. The Greystocks were the oldest of the Stark branches and before their treason they had been held in the highest esteem, the very image of how a cadet branch should act towards their father family and liege lords. They had marched beneath the direwolf banners on 100 different battlefields and at 1,000 more no longer remembered by men, but that made their treason all the worse. They had been the most trusted ally of Winterfell, and they had turned their back on their family in their lust for power. They had betrayed their own family, they had betrayed the pack and lost almost everything because of it. They had been stripped of their ancestral seat of Wolf's Den and their main source of income in its silver mines, they had their vaults plundered of what wealth they had stored away. Their lands were so heavily reduced that in the end they were left only with the poorest part on which to rebuild themselves. The grown men of the family had been put to the sword before the eyes of a wood tree and even their maidens had been taken as brides for the victorious lords, to ensure they would never be able to take up swords against the lords around them for generations. With so much of their family killed in the war, only children were left to take the Greystoke name, and the sons of the family were divided amongst the lords of the north and taken as wards, with few expecting the family to last more than a few generations before it would die out, and yet, despite all the odds, despite the efforts of old enemies and harsh winters, the Greystocks had persevered. They had used the prestige of their noble title, battered and shamed as it might have been, they were still a lordly house even if in name only, as leverage with the younger and wealthier families of the north and south, finding those newly entitled houses and great merchants who were desperate for the renown that came from being married into a family with a long and glorious history, such as the Freys, using the wealth of silver and gold they received as dowries from the families of their brides and the meager coin that had been left to them by Winterfell. They built a small keep, half in stone and half in wood, that would one day grow into the castle of Greyston, a small but formidable fortress that was like Winterfell made small, with the same architecture, the same layout and even the stone carrying the very same color as the blocks that made up the walls of the northern capital, but the greatest loss of theirs was one that could not be fixed so easily, their loss of honor and their trustworthiness in the eyes of many northern lords, and it was this shame that the Greystocks truly took to heart. In days long past, their words had been forever faithful, referring to how they were always the first to come to Winterfell's side and had always come to help their close kin, in matters great and small, never being far from the Starks of Winterfell when in battle, with a Greystoke even being named regent on a dozen occasions when the king in the north was too young to rule on his own. But after their treasonous act, those few surviving sons who had been spared from the slaughter were taught to feel nothing but shame for what the rest of their family had done, made to forever hate their brothers' uncles and fathers for the crime they had committed against their king and kin, telling the young boys that they had brought their fate upon themselves, that it was no one's fault but their own for losing so much and that they should be grateful for still having their lives. Though the lords of the north hadn't realized it, their words had sunk in far more deeply than they could have ever imagined, so much so that it was the Greystocks who told them to their children. Now, Old Nan says the first thing a Greystock learns is how to feel guilty. We shouldn't let them feel like that, though. It was over 1,000 years ago. Nowadays, the Greystocks dedicated themselves to their pursuit of redemption, never doing anything that might jeopardize their honor, trying to do anything they could to remove the taint that made many lords ask for larger dowries and offer less for their own maidens, all whilst expecting the Greystocks to do more and be given less for their efforts. But Bran knew his father wanted to see an end to it. But he couldn't force the lords of the north to forgive them, and nor could he force the Greystocks to forgive themselves for what their ancestors had done centuries before, since it was they who passed their burden from one generation to the next, not the lords of the north. Lyra fidgeted in her saddle as the direwolf looked towards her, only for the Greystock girl to turn away with tears in her eyes and lead her horse away from the group, going towards where the men of the household guard were waiting with the steeds of those who had dismounted to hunt. The Shwolf turned towards Brandon, looking at him as if to ask why Lyra had left, but the answer was clear enough to him. She didn't think herself worthy to touch a true direwolf, not after the Greystocks slew 4 of them in a rebellion that pitted cousin against cousin, even for the direwolves that followed their masters into battle. He sighed to himself, Goldwing returning to his vambrace as he raised his arm for him. "We best turn back to Winterfell," said his father as he checked the Shwolf's wound for the last time before turning to Jory again. "Jory, ride ahead of us and tell Farlin to find room for her and her pups in the kennels. It won't be long before she whelps." "Aye, my lord," he replied without a moment's hesitation, turning to leave and only managing a few steps before his lord father continued with a softer tone than before. "And try to make sure my wife doesn't learn of this just yet. I will tell her myself after we return. Only the gods know what mother will do when she finds out about this," muttered Robb to Jon. "She won't be happy," said Sansa, who was crouched down besides the direwolf and roughing its neck, unafraid of getting her clothes dirty. "But a direwolf hasn't been seen in the north for centuries. Maybe we were meant to find her. I saw one of the green men in the city. Maybe we could ask him if he's still there," suggested Arya with an excited grin as they started to leave the clearing, Domeric helping his eldest sister back onto her horse and a few of the attendants with them gathering up the stag's body for that night's dinner. "I lost half a bag of game, but I still have more than anyone else." Their father nodded with another smile in silent agreement as he led the way out of the forest, walking slower than he normally would to make it easier for the wounded direwolf to keep up with him, and with their steeds not far from view, Arto's Swampstark, who had been quiet for most of the hunt, trying to listen out for anything he could catch with his net and spear, asked a question Bran hadn't even thought of in all the excitement. "How did she get south of the wall? There can't be a hole in it. The builders would have found it and filled it in before it got big enough for her to get through, and she couldn't have swum round with pups inside her, so, how did she get here?" Jon paused for a moment's thought as he climbed atop his horse. "She mustn't have had the pups before she came south of the wall, else she would have never made it here. That means there must be a male south of the wall, too, somewhere, but I doubt we'd ever find him," said Donal as he looked around from horseback, sliding the bow beneath his shoulder and around his chest. "Direwolves can't be found if they don't want to be." "What would a male direwolf have to do with her?" asked Bran, not seeing what a male direwolf had to do with the female being pregnant. "Direwolves can't get married." Robb and a dozen of the other boys and even some of the ladies burst into laughter, with even his father giving a small chuckle at his innocent words. "I suppose now is as good a time as any to tell you where babies from," Bran said his father as Bran rode alongside him, Goldwing shooting back into the sky to follow them from the air, and by the time they reached the gates of Winterfell, he wished he had never asked. ********* End of Part 13. Notes. So, after a horribly long wait, it's finally here. It would have taken even longer, but I think changing POV at this point would be a good idea. That way we can see the return to Winterfell from someone else's perspective, like maybe Eddard's. Anyway, we see now exactly what happened in the clearing. In the brief moment Sansa and all her friends were away, the Shwolf arrived, and though she was cautious and afraid of them, Bran managed to use his powers as a walk to calm her down by half warging into her and showing her that he nor any of the others would do her any harm. Think animal empathy instead of animal control. It's a more advanced technique, but it's the best way to help get an animal accustomed to one's presence. So, reusing the car analogy from before, it's basically chatting with the car's owner first so that they have an idea of who you are before you try and hop into the driver's seat. Bran's aspirations to join the Kingsguard are definitely alive and well in this timeline, perhaps even stronger than they were in canon, since he dreams of being not just the first Stark to wear a white cloak, but to be the first Warg, too. He enjoys going on hunts with his family and friends, and he's really hoping that being such a good hunter will give him something in common with the king, but he certainly makes full use of Goldwing's abilities when hunting, that's for sure. Hunters and trackers with the ability to walk are actually relatively common in the north, with most settlements being less than 10 days travel from one of them, since it doesn't require much in the name of natural talent to control something like a bird. And even less to influence it enough to make it do one's bidding without taking manual control. But without the ability to take control and see through the eyes of the bird they hunt with, they are much less useful in times of war. And of course, Bran dreams so much of being in the Kingsguard that he really isn't that interested in having lands of his own, and though he turned the offer down, Eddard is happy to find him somewhere nice in the north if he ever changes his mind on what he wants to do with his life. Moving on, we see why Theon got his nose broke. He genuinely thought he was helping to keep Arya safe, so he took the shot by instinct and without forethought, thinking that the others would thank him for driving the direwolf off, and well, it didn't go as planned. And of course, there was never a discussion about whether to bring the direwolf back to Winterfell. A hesitation, yes, but no discussion, for what I am sure are obvious reasons. Tongue-poking smiley. And we see more about the Greystocks. While there are many lords in the north who try to use what the Greystocks did in the past as a way to get more out of them and give them less, one of their biggest problems is that the Greystocks haven't been able to forgive themselves for what happened all those years ago, and though Eddard Stark could order the lords of the north to treat them as an equal, he can't order the Greystocks to forgive themselves for the actions of their ancestors, and this is the main source of tension between the main part of the family and their cousins in the Company of the Wolf. The one group believes there is still much more work to be done for them to be forgiven, if they are ever forgiven for what they did, and the other has forgiven themselves and tried to move past it, saying that they've paid a price in blood in hundreds of battles since then, and though they might never have the station they once had in the north, they can at least try to move past their sins and do something with their lives other than always trying to be forgiven for it. And then there is the mystery as to how a pregnant direwolf ended up south of the wall. Winking smiley. Oh, and Bran gets the talk. Next part will cover the arrival at Winterfell with an Eddard Stark POV, and we'll be starting from the moment they enter the gates. Laughing smiley. Chapter 14, Eddard 2. Notes. This took a while, but I'm very happy to see it done. Laughing smiley. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Winterfell, a few hours later. Eddard smiled as the Schwulf walked alongside his horse at a comfortable pace, never once allowing herself to limp or to rest, and not once was he afraid she would collapse from her wound. Even a young direwolf could live through the harshest of winters, times when the sun would rise for only a few hours before setting again, when all prey was scarce and when water froze as hard as steel. But as she trod alongside him, careful to avoid anything that could knock her middle, it left him wondering where her pack was. All of the books in the den mention them traveling in packs of 10 to 20 till they started to disappear, but even then, no direwolf ever stayed on its own without a pack, yet alone a Schwulf carrying pups inside her. In the days of Torrhen Beefking, they had prowled the lands in great packs, some so great as to have more direwolves than there were in the kennels of Winterfell, being so dangerous in their numbers that even the Lord of Winterfell needed to wear all of his armor and go with a strong escort when going hunting if they were hungry, but so long as they had food of their own in the woods, they left the huntsmen and lumberjacks who entered their territory alone, though hunting dogs and the like were often less fortunate, as their shredded remains often showed. Even bears weren't safe from them, since even a single direwolf was often a match for a strong bear, and more so, if he managed to sneak up on them, as they often could. From the very moment he had first seen her wounded, he knew that it would be the right thing to bring her back to the city and let her wounds heal and let her stay if she wanted to. It's what my father would have done. If a Schwulf had been seen near Winterfell, he would have had every man in the castle riding out to find her, and he would have given a lordship to whoever managed to bring her back to the castle. He could still remember the day his elder brother, who was no older than Robb at the time, pleaded with their father to let him take 100 men beyond the wall to try and find as many direwolves as he could, even to try and bring them back to the north once more so that the Starks would never have to be without their most trusted companions ever again. But his father had convinced him that it was too dangerous, but he knew his father had been tempted to let him go, and the 10,000 gold dragons he had gifted to the Night's Watch said he made an attempt to have them brought to Winterfell, but the search had been fruitless. His sister had even prayed before the wood tree to be given a direwolf pup when she was only 5 days old, but the tree had been silent and not even the green men could say if they would ever see a direwolf again, yet alone have them as pets just as their ancestors had. Some thought that they could even die out entirely and join the children of the forest in the world of legend, never to be seen again, but here she was, walking alongside him and as real as the horse he rode upon. It was like a dream come true for any Stark, and it had been so close to turning into a nightmare. Had the stag managed to go a few feet further before being hit, or if the direwolf had been only a few inches to the side, he would have had to bury her. But his eldest daughter was right, a direwolf hadn't been seen in the north in nearly 200 years, and this one had instantly accepted all of them without a moment's hesitation, treating all of them well and following them without second thought, though Eddard couldn't shake the feeling that the Schwulf already knew where she was going, but that probably had something to do with Bran. His son was a powerful warg, and growing more powerful with every day that passed, or so it seemed, since his son had told him that he had calmed the Schwulf down when it had first met them. I'm only afraid that being a warg might make the Faith try to stop him from earning a white cloak. He could never be prouder of his son and his dreams to become a member of the Kingsguard. There truly was no more honorable or righteous a thing to aspire for, but a white cloak was an enormous responsibility and carried a heavy price he had made as clear as he could to his young, hopeful son. If he succeeds, he will never know what it is like to hold a son in his arms, or to see them grow into men with sons of their own. He'll never see his daughters take their first steps, or see them marry and fall in love. If he doesn't want such things, so be it, but I would not have any son of mine take such a duty without knowing what it means first. Bran had been silent ever since he had learned all there was to know about where children came from, and Arya, who he had called to the front so that she could hear the talk too, with Daisy explaining the parts that he had less knowledge about, had been more curious about the thing than her brother was, asking whatever question came to mind before going to Adra's side to learn more. I only hope she doesn't get any ideas from her. Since they had left the depths of the forest and entered the countryside proper, the day had taken a turn for the better, with the sun beaming down on them from high above and making the lands of the north as hot as they could ever be, with what little snow and frost there was from the night before melting and making the ground as soft and as muddy as the banks of the Trident had been in the final battle of the rebellion, but fortunately, his ancestors from 2 centuries before had used their growing wealth to start work on a series of roads to connect the growing settlements of the north together, offering prisoners such as thieves and poachers a chance to work on the roads and earn their keep with honest work instead of being punished or having to take the black. It took years of hard labor, but when they were done they were allowed a chance to go back into normal life, their crimes forgiven, and the result was the spider's web of cobblestone roads that weaved through the land, connecting the major cities and castles together, though most towns and villages had dirt paths instead of proper roads, since they either didn't exist when the roads were first built or weren't important enough to counter the cost, though the most important of them all was the Whitey Road that joined Winterfell to White Harbor, and though all the roads helped trade flow more smoothly, their purpose in winter was just as important. In the darkness of winter, when the snows fall thick and heavy, it is almost impossible for even the best scouts or wargs to find their bearings in the vast lands of the north. But the roads of the north meant that so long as they could find a road and follow it they were bound to find a place to stay the night, though the dirt paths were not so useful, since they could utterly disappear beneath the snows or be washed away by a thunderstorm in spring. We're not the only ones to have so many roads, though. The Lannisters have the most out of anyone and Dorne the least. The Lannisters, always looking for more ways to increase their own power inside the Westerlands to stave off their ambitious vassals, whether by arms or by wealth, had seen how the Starks had put those who broke the laws of the land to work and did the same, completely discarding the idea of executioners, torturers and dungeons in favor of sending all the criminals of the Westerlands into the depths of the gold mines to toil from dawn till dusk, never allowed to see the sun or the stars again. For the rest of their lives, they slept, ate and died in the mines for the wealth of the Westerlands. Others were worked to death building the enormous stretches of brick road that made the Westerlands easily the best place to do trade in the Seven Kingdoms, but the work was so brutal and backbreaking that the faith called it slavery and condemned those lords who practiced it, and in the end the Lannisters had gone back to the old ways in the days of Tytos Lannister, and it had finally died out entirely under Tywin Lannister himself, simply because the other lords of the Westerlands were more dependent on such incomes than House Lannister, so, by depriving his subordinate lords of such a source of labor, he weakened any families who might dare to defy his will. He tries to keep his enemies weak, so that none of them will ever have the strength to rebel against him ever again. My father would have done the same thing in his place. Without saying a single word as he raised his hand, he waved for Robb to come to the front, and his eldest son led his horse with only one hand upon the reins, nursing the other against his chest as if trying to hide what he had done and clearly afraid of whatever punishment he might be given. Father, once Maester Lewin has seen to your hand, you will go to the kitchens and help the servants whenever you are done with lessons for the day, he said with a calm but stern voice. You'll do this for a fortnight, even if your hand is better before then. Robb looked down to the ground sadly before meeting his father's gaze and nodding. Yes, father, I just wanted to stop him from shooting. He could have hit Arya. He could have, and you were right to try and stop him, but you could have pushed him instead of hitting him, just as you could have tried to tell him to stop. And if he hit Arya I would have dealt with him myself. He will be the Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands one day, Robb. He'll remember everything you say and do when that day comes. You want me to try and be friends with him, then? I want you to try and not be enemies with him. I cannot make you treat him as a brother, nor would he want you to after this, but I would ask you to treat him as an equal and give him no more reasons to hate you or the North. He met his son's eyes, just as his own father had used to whenever he asked his sons to do something for him. Can you do this for me, Robb? Robb nodded again without a moment's hesitation. I will. Thank you. Eddard gave his son a small smile. When Brandon and I were young, our father told us that the choices we made today would always have an impact on tomorrow, so we should never do something if we weren't ready to live with the consequences of it. What would Uncle Brandon have done, if he was in my place? Robb asked. Would he have hit him too? He would have drawn his sword, he said simply. If Brandon was there in Robb's place and Lyra in Arya's, Theon would have been dead before he could loose his arrow. And father? His son asked with a solemn and sad voice, afraid of not living up to what his father expected of his son and heir. What would you have done? Eddard smiled again, making his son feel more at ease. I would have hit him, and my father would have told me to push him instead. Robb laughed as he returned to his friends, more at ease than he had been when Eddard had him come to the front, accepting of the punishment he had been given, and more importantly, the words his father had given him. There's no point in giving a stronger punishment. Theon's nose will heal in time, as will Robb's hand, and anything more severe would just distract from what I told him. He will have plenty of time to think about what he did whilst he works in the kitchens. The Schwulf stepped over a small grey pebble and sniffed at the air with excitement, catching the scent of Winterfell for the first time before moving far more eagerly than before. Even for a mortal man with a mortal nose, every realm in the Seven Kingdoms had its own unique smell that could tell more about the land and the people that called it home than any book or maester ever could. The Vale smelled of old stones and old forests, the riverlands of bubbling streams and freshly cut timbers, the stormlands of damp earth and coming rain clouds, the reach of blooming wildflowers and unending fields of golden wheat, the Iron Islands of salt, smoke and the ocean's mist, but none of them were more alluring than that of the North and Winterfell and home. And none more foul than that of Dorne. Dorne and the North had a long and quarrelsome history that had begun with the construction of the canal, which had reduced the journey from Braavos to Lannisport to a quarter of what it once was, meaning the great merchants of the East could more quickly and safely make it to the markets in Westeros, which had crippled Dorne, as trade no longer flowed into their ports as it once had, and the people of the sandy, dry realm hated Northerners for it. They told their children horror stories about Northern lords, tales about how the Starks would give the babes of their defeated enemies to the wood trees to earn the favor of the old gods, how it had been him who had killed Elia and her babes, and how the entire rebellion was nothing more than a Northern scheme to usurp the Iron Throne, with Robert a Stark puppet who would marry a Stark girl before disappearing across the narrow sea, leaving Eddard Stark himself to rule as Lord Regent of the Seven Kingdoms. It was poison neither he nor any of his companions cared to hear, but the worst part of it all was how they refused to give them supplies or even any water for their steeds, and it left him and those who were with him no choice but to take them by force. We did some dishonorable things in Dawn, things I regret, but there was no other choice. We were only a day and a half's ride from the tower, not that we knew it then, but our steeds were weakening from thirst, and so were we. He sighed to himself, the sound going unnoticed by his sons and the wards placed into his care by the noble families of the north, and let himself smile again as he looked around the open countryside and saw one of the peaceful and prosperous villages that covered not just the lands of his family, but the kind that were across the entirety of the north from the wall to the neck, the orange cows of their herd allowed to freely roam the thawing plains beneath the watching eyes of a tall and thin tower, carefully built for a good field of view over both the village and their pasture, and at the top stood a few men, holding cheaply built hunting crossbows and spears, enough to protect their pasture and enough to deter any small band of wildlings who somehow found a way around the wall. One of them, a little younger than Rob from the look of him, still more a boy than a man grown, waved to him, and so he waved back, as any good and true legal lord would before continuing on his way towards the city of Winterfell. The North had no people who were born into servitude, not even amongst the common farmers who worked the land or the herdsmen who tended to the cattle. No, the people of the North were born free and they died free, just like the free folk beyond the wall. They could choose their own masters and where to live if they so desired, with some even leaving the North to seek their fortunes elsewhere, but the vast majority were content to stay at home, never traveling far from the town or village where they were born and doing the same work that their fathers and grandfathers had done before them, whether that was working in the fields or not. It had been one of the hardest things for him to learn when he had been outside of the North for the first time, and even though his old maester had taught him as much as he could about the South for the day he would become a ward, it took him weeks of awkward moments to fully realize what it meant. Even in Winterfell, there were a few servants who kept the faith of the Seven, people who had followed his wife north after the birth of their first child at the end of the rebellion, and he knew that some of them still came in to do their duties on days of fasting, which was in support of Huger of the Hill, who ate nothing but bread and water for 7 days as he led the first of the Andals to the hills upon which he would later be named king, even though it made them weak and weary. So, he always gave them a few coppers after each meal of the day, which meant that when they broke their fast on the dawn of the 8th day, they would have enough money saved up to have a hearty meal with good ale to go with it. It felt like the least he could do for them after their years of tireless service in a land that was as unfamiliar to them as the Vale had been to him, and they loved him for it, but in the Vale, it was different. Servants never expected such a reward for their duties as so few lords ever gave them out, since they expected nothing less than the best every day and would punish them for anything else, but they gave no praise and no reward for doing better, either, with some lords going so far as to say that living inside the castle's walls and having a few meals a day was payment enough for their duties. But when he had given his wooden training sword to a hopeful young serving boy on the Warrior's Day, Jon and Robert had been stunned into utter silence as he handed the boy the weapon and gave him a few words of advice on how to use it and how to defend himself from harm. Neither of them had expected the second son of such a powerful family to care much about the hopes and dreams of a low-born serving boy, yet alone one who kept the faith and not the old gods, and yet, he had. Jon Arryn had never been more proud of him. Robert had even tried to do the same, thanking the pretty young seamstress who mended his cloak in private after dinner one day, and 9 months later, she gave birth to his bastard daughter, Maya. Jon Arryn didn't even have to ask him if she was his, her coal-black hair and sky-blue eyes were proof enough of who her father was, and Robert had doted on her the way only a loving father could, getting her expensive gifts and toys whenever he could and having his brother Stannis send him more and more coin from the coffers of the Stormlands to get her whatever he thought she might have wanted, and when it came time for them to go to Harrenhal for the tourney, he had even planned to bring her along with him, only for Jon Arryn to tell him that it would be unseemly for the entire realm to see his bastard daughter besides him, especially when the king and all his family were present. It was one of the few times Robert had argued with Jon Arryn, even refusing to go without her for a time, till Jon Arryn reasoned that declining an invite to such a grand tournament would be a grave insult, not just to Lord Went, but to all the other guests who were coming to the tournament and were expecting him to be there, and of course, it meant he wouldn't be able to see his betrothed. He was in a foul mood the entire ride to Harrenhal, but once we got there he started to cheer a little and was his normal self again at the melee, but he was never the same after the rebellion. Rhaegar had almost killed him on the Trident, gripping the sword of his blade with one hand and the grip with the other before thrusting it through a dent in Robert's breastplate, only to be slain before he could thrust it home. But it left Robert with a wound so terrible the maester thought he might die that evening. But Robert was young, strong and too stubborn to die so easily, though he had been humbled by the epic duel, understanding that he might not live forever and that one mistake in the wrong time would be the death of him. His horse climbed over a small hill, the final obstacle, and on the horizon he saw his city, his home. Winterfell's thick grey walls stood tall and proud, covered in the distinct streaks and swirls of bright scarlet that marked the walls with the runes of the first men, promising that the battlements would never fall to any attacker so long as men with a love for the old gods still stood upon them, ready to take up arms for their defense of their home. He was unsure if there was any true magic behind them, no man could ever be certain of such things, but their effect on the defenders was real enough. There was not a man in the world who wouldn't become more confident when believing the gods were at their side, protecting him from harm and making sure his aim and strikes were true and deadly. The gates in their bronze plating stood wide open with merchants coming and going alongside villagers bringing their goods to market in the wealthy city, with only the teeth of the portcullis bearing above, gleaming in the light like the fangs of some forgotten monster ready to snap down on the people passing beneath them. Winterfell was the beating heart of the north, the place where all the major roads joined together and where the last great stretch of the King's Road came to an end, with only a smaller and narrower path, built in the days of the first King Jaehaerys, who was fondly remembered even in the north, continuing up from Winterfell to the Gift and then on to the Wall where it became the responsibility of the Night's Watch thanks to it being on their land. They had built new roads that stretched from Westwatch by the bridge to Eastwatch by the sea, so as to make it easier and quicker for them to redeploy men from one castle to the next even in a snowstorm, and there were rumors among the small folk and the men of Winterfell's guard that the Lord Commander was considering a new road in the lands beyond the Wall, the Frost Road some called it, but they were exactly that as far as he knew, rumors. Benjen would have told me if the Lord Commander had any plans for it, and if he did I would gladly give them my support. The free folk are no different than we were in the days before Brandon the Builder raised Winterfell. Who knows what they could do, if we let them live in peace. There were those few in the north who wanted to sally forth into the lands beyond the Wall to slaughter the free folk and wipe them out utterly, but he would have no such thing done, not when the Watch was in no need of aid or when the free folk had done no crimes against the Seven Kingdoms, and the word of Winterfell was law, iron and unquestionable, lest a lord find his lands and castle in the hands of the closest cadet branch, as his father had told him before, though he himself saw no need for such harsh measures, since they were happy to carry out his commands, and he knew every lord of his generation well enough to know how they would act long before he sent his messages to them, even if his brother knew some of them better than he had. He was always better with them than I was. That's why he was the heir and I the spare. He led his retinue forward with a smile as they headed towards the gatehouse, and he could hear the awed speech from those nearby as they looked towards his group and saw her at his side. "Direwolf," they said, "Eddard Stark has a direwolf. The Starks have direwolves." People stood still and made way for them to enter the city, in awe of the enormous Schwulf walking beside him, who trod forward and paid little heed to the crowds that were forming on either side of them to see what had not been seen in so long. Bells rung out across the city to tell of their return as men set down their tools and women stopped with their children beside them to see the wolf, and then the rumbling spread through the crowd as fast as lightning, the stunned murmurs turning to a thundering cheer that was as loud as the greatest of battles, racing through the city like a summer's blaze ripping through a dry forest, and in what felt like seconds it was as if every man, woman and child within the city was gathered on the streets that stretched before him to the castle above, jostling and vying for their chance to see the wolf, eagles perching atop of roofs and bears pushing through the crowds as the wargs of the Snowcloaks watched as their brothers in arms joined the cheering crowds and stopped anyone that might have wanted to run out and touch the Schwulf. They love her. We all do. He smiled as his horse stepped onward, waving for the crowd, for his beloved people, and the roar they gave him in reply was deafening. He reached for his leather coin purse, swollen near enough to bursting with enough silver that there was never an unexpected expense he could not handle, and he pulled apart the strings and took a handful of the coins within, throwing them into the crowds with a smile and a wave to any who caught them, Robb following his lead and doing the same as soon as he saw the first coin leave his hand. The cheering crowds grew louder at the sight of their lord's generosity. The Snowcloaks prevented any fighting from breaking out over the coins and keeping his goodwill honest and true. A small girl, no older than Arya was, slipped from her young mother's grasp with a blue winter's rose in her hands, running alongside him even as the snowcloaks rushed to stop her from getting too close to their lord. But before they could get anywhere near her, she was beside him, offering him the rose. "Thank you," he said with a smile, reaching down with a gloved hand and taking the rose from her as the snowcloaks stood and watched, the daughter's mother watching with pride as he mussed her hair. Then he reached into his coin purse again, and gave the brave girl a gold dragon, the only one he had carried with him for the hunt, and another smile. She ran back to her mother and father, their voices drowned out amongst the cheering crowds, and he watched her mother burst into tears at the sight of the coin. "They've never seen one before. I have hundreds of thousands more in the vaults of Winterfell, but they only need one to change their lives forever, so long as they use it well." He waved at her again, then continued on his way, leading his horse through the bustling streets and into the market, houses growing bigger and larger as the families who owned them grew wealthier and more able to house their kin from outside the city, and amongst the cheers a single word grew stronger and louder with every voice that joined the chant, direwolf banners flying proudly wherever the eye could see. Stark! 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 He threw coins to the crowds to left and to the right of him, aiming for those who looked as if they needed them most, never losing his smile, and when he saw the wood tree that watched over the city's busiest market looking down upon him from its hill with a wide smile and proud eyes, he couldn't but think that they were the eyes of his father, delighted at the return of direwolves to the north once again. "I can only hope that he is as proud of me as the people of Winterfell are." With the battlements of Winterfell in sight, he looked to the top of the gatehouse, searching for his wife's beautiful auburn hair. Whenever he entered the city, she always waited for him to return by standing atop the gatehouse, just as she had waited for her father's return when she was little, but found no trace of her there, a bad sign. She was always there for him when he returned to the castle after a hunt or any other journey that took him away from the castle, so he urged his horse on a little quicker and continued to the castle, throwing the last of his coins to an old man at arms, who still wore an old direwolf tabard over his chest, the tidiest and most well-kept of all the clothes he wore. The old soldier caught the coin and dropped to one knee, looking towards the ground and not rising again until he had passed down the street, a sign of the highest respect and done only by serving men in the presence of a king, or someone they respected and loved as much as one. He sighed as he looked at the castle again and saw nothing of the woman he loved so much, despite the cheers and the energy of the crowd washing over him like the waves of a beach. There must have been something wrong if she was not there to see him come home again, but someone would have ridden out to him if there had been an accident. No, that didn't bear thinking about. He refocused himself on the crowds to take his mind off of it, waving to the crowds once again with a smile he hardly felt like wearing, and the Schwulf knew it. She picked up her pace and moved faster, giving him a reason in front of the entire city to urge his horse to go quicker than before, and so he did, matching the direwolf's fast strides and crossing the last stretch of the street in what felt like the blink of an eye to his concerned mind. The castle was in as good a mood as the city, with men and women watching and smiling at the sight of the Schwulf, who sniffed around in search of something, or someone, but as much as he might have wanted to, he could pay her no attention, and he climbed from his horse as Roderick walked over, a weary expression on his face. Eddard swallowed whatever fears he might have had, and asked with lordly voice, "Where is my lady wife?" "She is inside the nursery with your youngest son," Roderick answered with a small and tired smile to his lord's unseen relief. "He has been giving her hell all morn, nightmares, or so it seems, and none of the maids can calm him but her, and herself not for long. I even tried to calm him the way I had Jory when he was still a babe, but nothing seems to work." "Oh." Eddard removed his riding gloves and passed them to a servant. "What of?" "I cannot be sure, my lord, just that he's been terrified ever since you left Winterfell. Caitlin told me he's been wanting to see me. I've been so busy as of late I haven't had time for my youngest." "I'll go see her," then he said, turning his attention to the Schwulf who Farlin was trying to entice with warm furs and fresh meat, the Schwulf looking over him carefully, then back to Eddard and the Great Hall. "Make sure she is well looked after, and have Lewin look at her wound." Roderick nodded. "Of course, my lord, and if I may say, what a sight she is." He smiled, taking off his quiver and passing it and his bow to another servant. "Aye, she is." He walked inside the castle and left the busyness of the courtyard, where love-struck men were helping the targets of their affection dismount and where hopeful young hunters were boasting to one another of their kills, even though Bran had more than everyone else combined. Inside the emptiness of the great hall, he could hear the sound of his son's wails being carried through the pipes in the walls and through the open doors and walls, and nothing could have made him move more quickly but a run. When he arrived, he saw old Nan and his wife trying everything they could to calm him, rocking him in turns and offering him toys and everything either of them knew to try and stop his tears, but the moment little Rukan saw him it became clear what it was he wanted. He tried to worm his way out of Caitlyn's arms, but with weariness across her, she walked over and passed him into Eddard's arms. Then Rukan stopped crying. "Don't go. Ever," muttered his youngest, the tiredness from all his constant crying quickly catching up with him. "It's all right," he said with his softest and most gentle voice as his tired wife sat down upon a chair to have a moment's rest. "I'm here now. Don't go." "I won't." Rukan smiled, and then he was fast asleep. He turned to Caitlyn and asked, his voice a whisper. What was he scared of? "He had a nightmare," she replied with an exhausted voice. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but he said there was darkness, drums and water. "The womb, from what I can make of it," said old Nan, taking Rukan from his arms and tucking him into bed when it was clear he wouldn't wake up. Not that he should remember that. "The womb. Gods give me strength, the pups." "Caitlyn, I." The Schwulf walked into the room, as silent as a shadow, and before he could say another word she walked past him and lay down at her feet, the first time she had done so since he and the others had found her in the Wolf's Wood. Caitlyn looked down at the direwolf in awe for a few seconds, then she looked at him in confusion. "How?" "I can explain everything in my solar, my lady." Caitlyn nodded at him with a tired and weary look, one he replaced with a small smile as he helped her rise from her seat again, and when he did, the Schwulf climbed back to her feet and walked alongside Caitlyn, the realization striking him in all of its force. The mother direwolf was following the mother of the Stark children. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 14. Notes. Oh boy, where to start? In this part, the Stark retinue returns to Winterfell after the hunt, the Schwulf in tow. In the past, there had been so many direwolves in the north that they were beyond counting, but over time, their number has declined, and eventually they disappeared south of the wall. Attempts were made to try and bring them back by trying to capture direwolves from the haunted forest and beyond, but it was extremely difficult for anyone to try and track down a direwolf in its native habitat and impossible to capture one there, and eventually, some people started to think that they had died out entirely, and that the rumors of them still existing beyond the wall were simply sightings of large wolves, not true direwolves. But when they were common in the north, they were common, and almost every cadet branch of the Starks had a direwolf or two with them, and the Starks themselves had one or two for every member of the family, and simply said, at that kind of number, they were utterly impossible to fight against if you were in smaller numbers, and they can be taught to tell the difference between someone who comes from south of the wall and those from beyond it. Simply put, they made wilderling raids a nightmare for anyone who tried to get close towards the true Stark lands. Eddard's father, Rickard Stark, was one of those who was eager to try and bring them back to the north, funding a dozen expeditions, and though they found real direwolves in the land beyond the wall, they were never able to capture one, and so they returned empty-handed. To say that Eddard's excited would be an understatement for sure, and the entire population of Winterfell are excited to see a direwolf again, just like how the people of Dragonstone would be excited to see dragons in their skies once again. And speaking of Winterfell, Eddard tries to be a good ruler there, one who stirs his people's hearts so that they carried out any command he gave them willingly, not because of any force he had to use, and he tries to act like a father might to his small folk. He rules with a firm, but gentle hand. Anyway, this Schwulf has an interest not in Eddard, but in Caitlyn, with the mother of the direwolf pups going to the mother of the Stark children, and simply put, we're going to be seeing more of her in the next part, as it'll be a Caitlyn POV and the last one before Robert and co arrive. And Eddard has tried to make it as clear as possible what wearing a white cloak means, especially in what it will take away from him. He knows a little of the regrets that Benjen has, and he doesn't want Bran to suffer from them unless he is absolutely sure he doesn't want those things. Nothing could make him happier than to see Bran join the Kingsguard, and nothing could make him sadder than to see Bran join the Kingsguard and realize he wants those things, so he is definitely trying to make sure he knows what he will miss if he does manage to earn himself a white cloak, despite the possibility that the Faith might try and persuade the royal family otherwise. Alongside the construction of the canal, one of the biggest things to have been built in the north is its roads, which are essential for reliable pathways during wintertime, since rivers can freeze and destroy wooden bridges as the water absorbed by the wood freezes and expands year after year, and normal roads can be covered in snow and become almost impossible to follow. But by building roads that stand a few inches taller than the ground on either side of them, it becomes possible to see where the road is even under snowfall, making it easier for someone to find one's way home, and the very existence of the roads is useful as a navigational aid, since you can reliably go to a road and follow it along and inevitably get to one of the major holdings of the north. In combination with this, there are now strong stone bridges at the important crossings of the north, though none of them have any freestyle setups, yet of course, the Starks aren't the only ones to realize the benefits of having more roads, and all of the Seven Kingdoms have more roads than in canon, and none more so than the Westerlands, who have so many of such high quality that even mountainside villages are close to good, paved roads along shallower slopes, making it easier to get goods to and from market by cart. Overall, House Lannister is in a far stronger position than they were in canon, thanks to their massively increased income. They can afford to reduce the output of their gold mines without sapping their own strength, so when they led the Westerlands away from prisoner/slave labor, it reduced the amount of spare wealth their vassals had, whilst keeping themselves in an unassailable position. Cutting the rest of the summary because of character limitations, see the comments for the remaining half. Laughing smiley. Chapter 15, Catelyn 2. Notes. Just remember, this is the final update for this update cycle. There won't be another until the Dragon of Harrenhal has reached part 10, because it's very, very far behind on its own update schedule, and until various other projects have had some tender loving care. Don't worry, there shouldn't be that much of a delay now that the Citadel says the summer is over, and that means my writing can start speeding back up. Laughing smiley. However, because AO3 has yet to see my pretty family trees and the information that comes with them, there'll be a special part 16 of sorts for the various trees and the little comedy one-shot that appear in the r.com thread. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. *********. Catelyn sighed to herself as she walked through the halls, her beloved husband on one side of her and the direwolf on the other, and Rickon far behind her, sound asleep in the nursery. On days like this, when she could not quieten her youngest babe, she felt terrible, for nothing she had tried had managed to calm him and make him happy again till her husband arrived, held him once and whispered a few soothing words to him, and then Rickon was asleep again. Nothing her Septon at Riverrun could have ever told her could have prepared her for that, or for his dreams about what could have only been the womb, or for her, the direwolf that was walking besides her. Why is she following me and not Ned? I am a Tully of Riverrun, not a Stark of Winterfell, and my family keeps the new gods, not the old, but she is at my side all the same. She looked towards the Schwulf, letting herself properly take in her shape and her great size for the first time. Her head was much larger compared to the rest of her body than on a normal wolf, that was for certain, and glancing at the great swell of her middle, where her pups were waiting to be born. It wouldn't be long before she gave birth to them now, not with how big she was and how her little Rickon had seemingly managed to walk into one of the pups inside her in the middle of the night, but if her youngest child had managed to forge a bond with an unborn direwolf, what about the rest of her children? Were they all wargs? What if the Schwulf was carrying as many pups as Catelyn herself had children, or more? Would that mean she was going to have more children? There were hundreds of questions, with more and more of them coming to mind with every second that passed in silence, but only one of them had an answer for her. The mother wolf had sought her, the mother of the Stark family, out, even though they had never seen one another before, even though she wasn't a Stark or even of the first men, even though she had been praying to the Seven since she was old enough to understand what the faith was, and the Schwulf was following her already, sitting down whenever she sat and walking whenever she walked. The fact she had walked into the nursery to sit down at Catelyn's feet only to stand back up and follow her out of the room was proof enough of that. If only she had followed Ned instead. She quietly sighed to herself, hoping that her husband did not hear and hoping that she could take her mind off it. She needed to think with a calm and clear mind, one able to focus on the Schwulf, not one that was tired out and weary from trying to get her littlest to rest, or one that was still surprised by the mere existence of the Schwulf walking besides her. No, she had to be focused and steady and above all, calm, just as her uncle Brindon had taught her to be when she was but a shy little girl at Riverrun all those years ago, long before the birth of either Lysa or Ed Muir, before the death of her own mother in childbed made her become a lady at the age of 6. Just as how Sansa was as mature as a woman twice her age because of all the responsibilities and expectations placed upon her by all the other young ladies of the North who looked to her for guidance. Sansa must be so excited by all of this, all of my children must be, but why me? There was nothing more she wanted than a simple and quiet life with the man she loved the most, but the Shwulf, she had a meaning to the people of the North, whether they kept the old gods or not. But what would it mean to them if they saw her following someone who had become a Stark by marriage and not by birth? It was enough to make her want to leave her husband in the halls and go to the September to light a candle and utter a prayer to the crone for guidance before even discussing it. But she was a Tully of Riverrun and her words were simple: family, duty, honor. Her husband and all of her children were Starks. The direwolf was their symbol, and merely looking at her husband's smiles and glances towards the Shwulf said that she and her pups were already a part of their family. So, did that not mean that she had a duty to accept her, too? I only hope Ned can explain everything. Her husband, so obviously sensing the conflict raging inside of her, gave her a reassuring smile as he opened the door to his private den, a room with a key that was passed down from one generation of Starks to the next, just like their family blade was intended to by only the most trusted of servants. He stepped inside first and the Shwulf followed, lying upon the warm and soft snow bare pelt before she could even take her first step. She stepped inside silently without uttering a word, taking a seat opposite of her husband in a chair of masterfully crafted oak, the wood as silent as the entire room. "Catelyn," her husband said with a quiet and apologetic tone. "I'm sorry for surprising you with her. None of us expected to find her in the woods. I would have had Jory tell you, but I thought it best to tell you myself. I knew Jory had came back from the hunt early, but I hadn't had a chance to speak with him anyway. You needn't be sorry about bringing back a direwolf, Ned, but why is she following me? I'm not a Stark." Her husband cut her off with another soft smile. "You are, if not by birth then by marriage. You've birthed 5 Starks, and if the gods are kind we'll have a few more yet. You are a Stark now, and there's not a man in the North who would say otherwise." A warm feeling rose inside of her at his words. There had been countless lords in the North who thought she would give her husband weak sons or only daughters, and dozens of women who were all too eager to take her place if she ever died in childbed or from a winter's chill, and in the early days of their marriage she was sure they said as much to one another. But now, after giving her beloved husband 3 strong sons and 2 beautiful daughters, they said nothing. "But still, why would a direwolf follow me, Ned? I could understand if she followed you, or your sister if she still lived, but why would she pick me over anyone else? Over people from the North who keep the old gods?" Eddard's cheerful mood died down at the mention of his sister, his smile fading away to a more solemn look. "You are both mothers." She looked towards the Shwulf, who had silently set herself down in front of the fire and curled up to rest after her long journey to the castle, though she seemed a little restless, wiggling often on the pelt as she struggled to get comfortable. It wouldn't be long before she gave birth. Now, everyone who had ever lived inside a castle knew that there was no greater sign of a bitch readying to whelp than her refusing to stay still. "And when she does, her pups will follow my children and they'll keep each other safe, or so I might hope." When she did, would her pups follow her children around and keep them safe, just as the direwolves of the past did? "I would hope so. No one could ever hurt any of my children then, if there was a direwolf at their side to keep them safe from harm." She smiled slightly towards the Shwulf. She was 5 feet high at the shoulder, perhaps another foot above it, as large as a pony and twice as muscular, certainly strong enough to rip a grown man from horseback if need be. She might not have liked the idea of such a powerful beast following her children around, especially her little Rookon, but only a fool could even try and deny the benefits of having direwolves besides her children. They would do more than keep them safe. They were a living, breathing symbol of the North's power and of the Stark dominion over that power, but that was not something that should have been hers, and yet, it was. For whatever reason she had, the direwolf had chosen her over Ned, and it boggled her mind as to why it could have been so. "It can't be as simple as he says, can it? I brought 5 Starks into the world and I am a mother to them, but surely that can't be enough to have her loyalty." She turned back towards her husband and asked with a quiet and solemn voice. "Is there another direwolf in the woods?" "Your direwolf? There must be one in the North somewhere. I cannot see how a pregnant Schwulf could make it through the wall on her own, but... Her husband sighed. There's no sign of him in the Wolf's Wood, and it is nigh impossible to find a direwolf unless he wants to be found. Then, I hope he shows up sooner rather than later, she said with a soft smile. I'll need your help with her, Ned. I never imagined having a direwolf of my own, not once. Her husband reached out across the table and took her hand in his, smiling. I will help you whenever and wherever I can, love. I swore as much before the gods old and new on the day you became my wife. All of Winterfell will help you with her, should you need it. She smiled and climbed from her chair to leave. It would be hard for her to get used to her presence and even harder for her to come to terms with what she meant, but with her loving husband at her side to help her whenever she might need his aid, she knew. There is more, her husband said with a bitter tone as she turned to face him again. Theon almost hit Arya with an arrow during the hunt. The Schwulf perked up and rose to her feet to pace around the room as Catelyn stared at her husband in silence. He what? It was an accident, her husband said, trying to calm her. The Schwulf had snuck up on us, even Bran didn't see her till she was beside Arya. Theon shot at her, in case she tried to attack, but Robb hit him and broke his knuckles, too. She took a deep breath. Her husband had come back from the Greyjoy rebellion with Theon in tow, heir to the Iron Islands now that all of the young Cricken's brothers were slain in Balon's foolish attempt to break from the Iron Throne. He had been a quiet and anxious boy then and had been nervous around the eldest of Robb's friends, but for a time he and Robb got along well, and Catelyn had hoped that Theon might have been able to pry Robb away from his bastard brother, but the reverse had happened instead. Theon had picked on Jon for being a bastard, so Robb and his friends cast him out and hadn't been fond of him since, whilst Theon himself had given up on trying to make friends with them, or so it seemed, choosing to instead spend his days in the city drinking and whoring. Theon had picked on Robb's bastard brother, so her son and all his friends had cast him out and hadn't been fond of him since, whilst Theon himself had given up on trying to make friends with them, or so it seemed, instead choosing to spend his free time in the city drinking and whoring, something she hadn't truly minded, since it kept him out of trouble and away from Robb. Her husband did his best to try and guide him away from such things, but none of his lessons seemed to take, and that was one of the most important reasons for Theon to be warded at Winterfell. He was not just a hostage meant to keep the peace, but a guest to be welcomed and befriended so that he would never want to wage war against the realm again. But now he had shot an arrow towards her youngest daughter, even if it was by accident and done with the best of intentions. She wanted him at Winterfell no longer, not when there was a chance he might accidentally lose an arrow at Robb or anyone else, something that seemed like it was only ever getting more likely. Perhaps it would be best to have him warded at another castle, then she suggested with a voice as cold as winter. There was not a single cadet branch of the Starks who would refuse having him in exchange for having their children at Winterfell. Indeed, they would probably be glad to do so. Send him to Darkport or to Greyston or to anywhere other than Winterfell. I don't want him near our children anymore, Ned. I was thinking about it, actually. Her husband rubbed his tired eyes. Jon Arryn would know how to handle him. There's not much different between Theon and how Robert was when he was his age, or so it seems. A small smile formed as she thought of an idea. If Robert and Theon were so similar, then perhaps they would get along well enough that the king would be happy to take him on as a royal ward. The Greyjoy boy would be taken to the capital, far away from Winterfell and the north, watched over by the king's guard and taught how to sail the narrow sea by the master of ships himself. It would be better for everyone, not just Theon but for Robb and the rest of her children, too. Even her husband's bastard would no longer have to put up his constant mockery. If he and the king would get along well, then maybe he should be a royal ward. Let Robert have him in King's Landing. Eddard nodded in agreement with her. I will have a raven sent to King's Landing, and if the king is willing to have him then I will have Theon sent by ship from White Harbor as soon as I can. She smiled at her husband. Thank you. I know you wouldn't want to send him away after the king entrusted you with looking after him, but I think it is the best thing for him, now. It is. He needs to learn how to sail, else the rest of the Ironborn would never accept him as their lord, and he cannot learn how to do it so far inland. Stannis could teach him such things better than I ever could. Is there anything else? Only that Arya is becoming a fine hunter in her own right. She was almost as good as Bran, but he was too fast for her to keep up, her husband said with nothing but fondness. Daisy is teaching her everything she knows. She nearly sighed in front of her husband. She loved her youngest daughter with all of her heart, just as any mother should, but she could never approve of the things Arya liked to do. It was unwomanly for a young lady such as her to use the bow or go hunting. Even women riding for fun was frowned upon in some parts of the south, but her daughter had no interest in anything that a proper lady should have. Her stitches were clumsy and lacked any finesse. She danced as if she was blind and club-footed, and then there was her skill at the harp, her playing of which always resulted in sounds that would be at home in the deepest, darkest depths of the seven hells. But she's not bad at them because she doesn't have any talent for it, but because she's not interested in anything that a lady should be interested in. She can fight almost as well as Bran can, only being worse because she started training later than he did. Ned, must you keep letting her do such things? They're unladylike, she reasoned. Even the other ladies of the north do not hunt or fight like she and Daisy do. Are they? Her husband responded with a small smile. Daener and Visenya Targaryen both went on hunts and liked to fight, and they were both queens in their day. The North was always fond of the Targaryens till the rebellion. It's no wonder he knows of them both well enough. I would never stop any of our sons or daughters from doing whatever they want to do, so if she wants to hunt or fight, so be it, he finished as he rose from his seat and started towards the door. Catelyn nodded without saying a single word in disagreement. She knew better than anyone that her husband rarely ever changed his mind when it came to matters involving their children or his bastard son. She had tried for weeks and months on end to try and convince him not to have him legitimized, to stop him from turning the bastard boy into a very real threat to Robb and all their other true-born children, but Eddard had simply made the arrangements for children from the Stark's bastard branches to come to Winterfell now that they were of age, taking them on as wards and showing her how quickly they had become friends with Robb and his half-brother, and now, they were utterly inseparable from one another, with Eddard and Torrhen Karstark never being more than a dozen feet away from Robb except when they were in bed at night. The reverse was just as true, not just for her children but also for the generations of Starks that went back to centuries beyond counting. If the Starks of Winterfell were the father of all their cadet branches, then the branches themselves were their pups, and though they might quarrel against one another and fight from time to time, they were still kin, and a threat against one was a threat against the entire pack. And just as a direwolf would never allow his pups to be harmed, just as the Starks of Winterfell would never allow their cadet branches to be truly threatened. No, they would raise their banners in defense of their kin, no matter how distant they might have become, settling feuds between them fairly and peacefully in the halls of Winterfell so that they might avoid shedding the blood they shed. They've always protected their branches and come to their aid whenever it was needed, and I love my husband, but he wouldn't change that, not even for me or anyone else in the world. Her husband opened the door for her and the Schwulf with a warm and loving smile, but the moment he did they heard the echoing of cheers from just outside the keep, carried along the halls by cold air and accompanied by laughter and the clapping of hands. It was fight night, she knew, a time when the future lords of the North drank plenty of ice wine, stripped down to their breeches and fought one another in the snow, beating each other senseless in fast, brutal fights with only their fists and feet as weapons. It was an ancient tradition, and it was utter madness, a madness that had started to spread outside the North, as it was a good way for brothers and friends to ease the tension during winter. Her brother Edmure was supposedly a good brawler in his own right, having gotten into a fight with a young Free named Oliver after a sudden springtime thaw had washed out the roads and flooded the banks in the night, leaving his entire party stuck until the water went down again. Oliver and a few other Freys had been on their way to a tournament at Seaguard, and though the day had started amicably enough, the pressure had started to build as the men drank and japed to each other to pass the time, and eventually, her brother Edmure had asked if Oliver's sister, Roslyn, was as ugly as the rest of the Free brood. Edmure, were you honestly expecting him to agree with you and not to start a fight? After her brother had made his way back to Riverrun, boasting of winning, even though his nose was broken alongside all of his knuckles, not to mention almost losing an eye, her father had punished him by sending him away to the Arbor for a moon's turn, so that he could think about what he had done far away from the Riverlands, naturally making sure to give him plenty of gold so that he wouldn't have to ask for anything, whilst Oliver had returned to the twins bloody and beaten, and Walder Free had sent him to the wall for striking the son and heir of his legal lord, and losing, if she knew him as well as she thought she might. "Tell me, my lord husband," she said as a servant walked past with fresh candles for the night. "Did you ever take part in those fights?" Once or twice, her husband replied with a lordly face as he closed the door behind her, but in those grey eyes of his she could still see the love he had for her, no matter how hard he tried to keep up the stoic appearance that befitted the Lord of Winterfell in public. It was after having a little too much wine and being too drunk to stop Brandon from dragging me into the fights. He once fought against the Great Jon Umber for nearly an hour straight before Maester Wallace and Roderick had to put an end to it. "Who did you fight?" she asked out of curiosity as they entered the stairwell at the end of the hall. "Rickard Karstark," he answered as they headed down the steps. "It was a fair enough fight for Roderick. Rickard was taller and heavier than me, but he was even more drunk than I was. We had all had half a bottle of wine each, since it was the last day before I would leave for the Eyrie." Her husband laughed quietly, the sound echoing through the empty stairwell. "I had to meet Jon Arryn with the bruises still healing, but they made me fast friends with Robert. He must have asked 100 questions about where they came from. He had never heard of the unarmed melee before, but he was asking Jon Arryn if he could go to Winterfell to see it for himself before long." She smiled, following her husband into the great hall. "I am sure the king would be delighted to visit Winterfell sometime, my lord husband. Mayhaps we should send him an invitation. And when he comes here we could give him Theon Greyjoy at the same time." "It has been a long summer," her husband said. "It can't be long now before winter comes, and after a long summer there is always a longer winter. After the thaw, perhaps, when the Winter's End festival begins." There was not a part of the Seven Kingdoms that did not look beautiful either in spring, summer, autumn or winter, and the north is at its most beautiful in those days when winter is finally giving way to spring, a time when the snow on the ground is still a thick blanket of white refreshed every night, but when the warmth of the sun is finally starting to make itself known again as the days grow long and people can start to leave their homes for more than a few brief hours at a time. Once, she had opened the shutters of her chambers to watch the sunrise and she had saw the snow-covered fields of the land around the city gleam a brilliant gold for just a few short moments as the sun rose across the horizon, but in the little time it was there it was more beautiful than the greatest sculpture or the most precious gemstone. Then there was the celebration of the end of winter, something that all of the kingdoms did in their own unique way, which had the added flair of celebrating the victory of the first men over the others at the end of the long night, glorifying the legendary deeds of Eldrick Shadowchaser and building wights and ice spiders out of snow to smash apart on the final day of the celebration, though the strangest part of it all was the swords of frozen fruit that were so popular at that time and unavailable at any other, a mockery of the frozen blades the others had wielded against the living in the battles of the long night made by pouring crushed fruits into wooden casts that were buried in the frozen earth turn the juices to ice. Of course, the tales the entire festival was based off of had been passed down from one generation to the next by word of mouth, growing more twisted from their original incarnations with every retelling, but they were entertaining nevertheless, and even the Northmen thought of them as an enemy long vanquished, something to scare the children with whenever they had been naughty. My good brother Benjen told us that even the free folk do not speak of them much anymore when we feasted him last year. Her husband led her out into the courtyard with the Schwulf walking beside her, the direwolf's footsteps completely silent against the thunderous cheers of all the wards of Winterfell and all of her children bar little Rickon, watching as her husband's bastard fought against Tigett Darkstark in the place where they might sometimes cross their training swords, surrounded by tables covered in cups of good wine, Roderick Castle watching intently for the moment one fighter was clearly beaten or if he had to intervene and put an end to the fight for their own good. Most of the men had hand wraps with padded leather gloves and were bare-chested or wearing shirts that could be quickly taken off if they were called up to fight, some of them already bloody and battered from fights that had already taken place, whilst the ladies of the court were there, cheering on their brothers and beloved from the sides, and she saw Arya too, sat upon one of the tables with Brandon besides her and Daisy looking after her and telling them both about the strategy and tactics of the melee. I would rather have them both inside instead of watching this, but so long as Daisy is there to keep them both out of trouble, I will leave them be. Jon Snow sent Tigett reeling with a punishing left straight against the Darkstark's cheek, the brown and golden-haired youth barely able to withstand the aggressive assault as Jon followed up with a right, keeping the pressure on and the momentum he had started to build. Robb grinned from the sides, fully dressed and his broken knuckles already bandaged. "Give him hell, Jon." "TYG," yelled Adra with fear as her brother staggered and swayed. "You can still win this. Seven have mercy, I will never get used to seeing this." Tijet looked to his sisters for the briefest of moments as John took a breath to move in for what could only be the final blow of the duel. It was obvious he hadn't the energy for a sustained fight. He had to end it with his next attack, else John was bound to outlast him and finish it himself. He turned back to John as the bastard threw another punch with all the force he could muster behind it, building up to a near run as he hurled it against him. Only for Tijet to catch his wrist, just barely, and with a swing of his legs so fast she almost missed it, he swept John's legs out from beneath him and smashed his free fist straight against John's face so hard both of them shouted out in pain as blood streamed from John's eyebrow, split open from the sheer force of the impact, and as Tijet dropped John to the floor, clutching his overhand as John landed upon the ground with a pained thud. Roderick immediately stepped forward as Rob rushed over to John just as Adra did to her brother, ripping his gloves off and quickly unwrapping his sword hand to show the surging purple spreading across the place where his last and third knuckles had once been, the bones behind them broken and the fingers skewed to an unnatural angle. Tijet stared at his hand whilst Rob pulled John to his feet, who spat out the band of leather meant to protect his teeth and letting Roderick take a good look at him. Roderick said as he gripped John's chin and tilted his head to take a better look, eyes narrowing. "You'll need stitches. Rob, take him to Mayor Stillowin, and you too." He turned to Tijet and Adra. "You've broken your hand." John nodded as he took his hand wrappings and placed them against the cut to stanch the bleeding, holding them tight and closing his right eye to keep the blood out of it. "I would call this one a tie," John Tijet said with a pained smile as he and Adra walked over to his side, Lion sighing and shaking her head before following the others to Mayor Stillowin's tower. "A tie, after all that." "Well fought, John," her husband said as Rob and his bastard brother passed by, John smiling at his father before continuing on his way. "And you too, Tijet." Roderick went to the table that Arya and her brother were sat upon, picking up an old greedilm that was just besides them and filled with rolls of parchment, each having the name of a man willing to fight and ready to be called up at a moment's notice. A bucket filled with the names of all those who had already fought left safe in the dead center of the table. Once their fight was over and done with, he would take their names and place it into the bucket, continuing either till he ran out of names or it was too late to continue the fights, after which he would take both the bucket and the helm and keep them safe for the next time they fought, never letting anyone who had already fought do so again till the helm was completely emptied, so as to make sure they had a chance to recover from the last bout before going into another. It was a crude method, but it meant that the next generation of Northern Lords were less likely to have any lasting wounds from their time at Winterfell. But if someone's turn came up and they were obviously unfit to fight, Roderick would put their name back into the helm till there came a time when they were able to not just fight, but to fight well. He took 2 pieces of the parchment and set the helm down again before working his way through the crowds and back to the open field, the men eagerly awaiting the announcement of who would fight then, and then Daisy, who was smiling perhaps a little too much for a woman who was only there to watch, whispering something into Arya's ear and made her laugh before handing her a long piece of scrap cloth and letting her wrap it around her hands with the utmost care. "Torrhen Karstark," Roderick announced loudly, so that there was no one in the crowds who could not hear. "Step forth." The eldest of the Karstarks at Winterfell proudly stepped forward with his strong arms raised in the air, grinning and garnering a cheer from the crowds before tearing his shirt off and turning the cheering to laughter at the sight of a dozen chunky runes of the first men drawn in charcoal on his bare skin, covering him from waist to neck, looking like a fierce warrior about to march into the bloody battles of the Andal invasion. "Daisy Mormont," Roderick continued as he read the second sheet of parchment, looking towards the Mormont woman with the utmost respect and not the scorn or contempt that she would have in the South for being a fighting woman. "Step forth." Gladly she smiled as she walked over, hands wrapped but ungloved, curling into fists with practiced movements that caught Torrhen's eye, and put the slightest hint of concern in them. "It's not fair for me to fight with my jerkin on," she said as she unstrung it and threw it to Arya along with the shirt beneath, who caught them both with a wide grin as her best friend readied herself to fight, her bosom kept out of sight and supported by a linen girdle, a sight that made her want to have a man-at-arms take Bran away or at the very least cover his eyes till she had her clothes back on. "It's not proper. It's not proper to strike a lady," Torrhen objected without a doubt in his voice. "I couldn't fight her even if I wanted to." "Come now, Torrhen," Daisy said with another smile as she put on her gloves. "I'm not made of glass. I can handle anything you have." "She's willing to fight," Roderick said as he turned to Torrhen. "You'd be doing her a greater dishonor by choosing not to fight than by fighting her, and an even greater one if you hold back." Torrhen looked towards her husband, in desperate need of guidance and hoping for an answer. All her solemn husband did was nod. Torrin swallowed. "All right, I'll fight, but I don't like it one bit. I won't hold back, Daisy." Daisy smiled at Torrin, but it was not like the other warm smiles. No, it was the grin of a wolf staring down at wounded prey that stood no chance. And Torrin knows it. Daisy seemed to dance on the spot as Roderick stepped back into the crowd, her feet moving as deftly as the fluttering of a butterfly. "I won't hold back on you, either." Torrin looked to his brother with an expression so grim it made him laugh. "Ned, promise me you'll look after her when I'm gone," he japed with the tip of his head towards Alice, even Daisy herself laughing. "Promise me, Ned." Her husband turned as pale as winter's snow, walking off to the Godswood in utter silence as the fight began, Daisy darting across the courtyard as fast as a warhorse towards a horrified Torrin before unleashing a ruinous rain of blows before he could even raise his arms to try and defend himself, hitting him with over and over with fast and hard stabbing, cutting and slashing punches that immediately threw him off balance. But Caitlin paid no attention to the utterly one-sided fight, not when her husband so clearly needed her. She quickly followed, but she barely managed 6 steps before she noticed the Schwulf was gone. I never heard her footsteps over the sound of all the fighting. Where could she have went? She sighed quietly. "It doesn't matter, I will find her later, but now, Ned needs me." The cheering and the laughter started to die down as she got further away from the training field, the sound becoming a dull echo behind her as Eddard stepped into the Godswood, herself not far behind. It was the oldest part of Winterfell, the one place that had not changed over the centuries even as the rest of the castle and the city had grown. The wood tree was the same as it had been, its crimson leaves shaped like hands and its thick bark as white as bone, with a face as solemn as those of the Starks who prayed before it, and though the rest of the trees in the garden might wither and die, fresh seedlings taking their place to grow anew, the wood tree was truly eternal. "Ned, what's wrong?" His reply was near a whisper. "It is nothing you need to trouble yourself with, love." "Ned, you can tell me anything," she said, closing the distance between the two and putting her hand on her husband's cheek as she looked into the grey eyes of the man she loved so much. Her husband sighed, looking away from her and towards the wood tree. "It doesn't matter, Ned." "It was to do with the war," he said, his eyes locking with hers and filled with sadness. "I would rather not to speak of it, if you would let me." She nodded with understanding, putting her arms around her husband and embracing him. Nothing could ever hurt her as much as seeing him like this, but if he felt better not speaking about it, then she was happy to leave the matter be and help him get over whatever it was at his own pace. "He will tell me if he wants to tell me, and not before." Then she heard a sound, so quiet as to be no louder than the noise of a soft breath, a quiet mewling coming from the far side of the wood tree next to one of the 3 hot pools. She let go of her husband and peered around the tree and saw the Schwulf coiled up on the moist soil, her body wrapped around her newborn pups, all of them squirming around in the middle as she kept them warm and safe with her massive body. "Ned, she's given birth," she said quietly and with a small smile as the Schwulf moved ever so slightly to give her pups a little more room and to let them feed for the first time. Her husband moved to her side, taking a look for himself before smiling. "She has." They were tiny when compared to their huge mother, only a little bigger than the pups of any other hound or wolf, but they had entered the world with thick coats of fur already grown to help them withstand the bitter cold, but to her it made them look like small balls of fur, their little legs and paws almost unnoticeable amongst their thick furs, but they were beautiful. "There's 5 of them," her husband counted, moving the mother wolf's fur ever so slightly to see the pups more clearly, showing one of the pups, whose fur was as grey as storm clouds and smoke, was already feeding as his mother licked at his head to clean away the last of the membranes stuck around his ears. "One for each of our children," she said as she turned over one of the little pups, a she, who had managed to roll herself over somehow, the light grey pup being gently picked up by the scuff of her neck by her mother and placed against a teat to suckle. "One for all the Starks." "All of them but Jon," her husband said sadly. 2 she-pups and 3 males. There were a few happy laughs as Arya and Bran entered the Godswood, the fight over. "Daisy won, and she's going to teach me." Arya and her brother stopped dead in their tracks as they saw the pups for the first time, her husband waving them over quietly. "We'll need to move her to the kennels, she can't stay here in the Godswood. She must have come here because it is one of the quietest places in Winterfell, and one of the warmest. Bran, find Robb and bring him here," she said as quietly as she could. And Sangza too, if you can find her. My husband can look after Rukun's pup for the time being, but only the gods know how he'll react when he finds out. As her second son raced out of the courtyard to find his elder brother and sister, she looked to the Schwulf's pups and smiled. There was no desire in her heart to try and keep the pups away from her children, or to send them away with their mother once they were able to walk and survive on their own. No, it was obvious that her children were meant to have the pups, that much was clear. The gods old or new had sent them, for what were the chances that a pregnant Schwulf, the first seen south of the wall in 200 years, would be found near Winterfell in the Wolf's Wood and to give birth the same day to the same number of pups that she had true-born children? It's a sign, but of what I cannot say. Perhaps the gods have sent them to show my children that they have their favor, or maybe they are here to help them when they need it most. Her husband picked up the little black pup that was slowly wiggling towards the pond, his soft fur as dark as a moonless sky at midnight, placing him against his mother's belly so that he would have his chance to feed alongside all his siblings. Arya stepping over and putting her hand on the mother wolf's body, smiling, the Schwulf licking at her hands and making her laugh even as one of the little pups started cooing at her, letting go of her mother now that she had fed and trying to move towards Arya, only for her mother to pick her up and put her back with all the others as soon as she got too far. She likes you, she said to her youngest daughter with a smile. Are we going to keep them? Her daughter asked, her grey eyes showing just how much she wanted to have a direwolf of her own. Please? Catelyn looked to her husband, who smiled and nodded. Aye, we will be, if the Schwulf's willing to let us have them after they've been weaned. Brandon walked into the Godswood with excitement, Robb and Sansa following him in along with the bastard, whose cut had already been cleaned and sewn shut to heal, and as soon as the three saw the pups squirming around on the ground and suckling they rushed over, smiling as wide as they could at the adorable sight before them. Gods be good, her eldest child said as he looked at the wolves, they're like balls of fluff. I've never seen something so wonderful, Sansa said as she cooed over the smallest of the pups. The bastard looked over, smiling just like her children were, then he realized how many there were and of which gender, and she watched as his heart broke in complete silence, his excitement turning to the grim melancholy of a man who had seen all his hopes and dreams come so close to fruition only to be dashed to pieces in front of him, the same way Petter had once looked to her after Brandon had hamstrung him and forced him onto his knees, ready to finish him off with a single thrust through his heart, as he would have if Catelyn hadn't asked him to spare the life of the friend who had grown at her side. Even she couldn't help but feel fitter for her husband's bastard. Eddard was willing to have him legitimized and to give him the name Stark. He was even willing to give him a lordship of his own somewhere in the north and arrange a good marriage for him, but he would have no direwolf of his own, and without a wolf he would never be a true Stark, despite everything her husband might do for him. She had never been close with him, but it was a bitter thought even for her to see that no matter how much he tried or how close he might get to her children, he could never truly belong with the rest of the family he loved so much, just like Petter. Come, her husband said as he rose, picking up the little black direwolf as soon as he had finished suckling, we best take them to the kennels so they can rest more comfortably. Sansa took the tiniest of the litter into her arms, a little Schwulf she held in her arms the same way that Catelyn had first held her, humming softly to stop her from whining, just as Catelyn had hummed to her, and rocking her arms ever so gently to calm her and make her comfortable, just as Catelyn had. She had never been more proud of her daughter than in that moment. She won't be a girl for long, she's growing up, and she'll be a woman before long. Arya quickly followed, picking up the other she-pup, looking to her elder sister and trying to copy what she did only for her pup to latch onto her fingers with toothless gums when she tried to stroke her calm. Sansa took the tiniest of the litter into her arms, calming the whining and scared little Schwulf with a caress from the back of her hand and a warm smile, Arya quickly following and picking up the other she-pup, trying to copy what her sister did only for the pup to bite and latch onto her fingers with toothless gums that tickled instead of doing any harm. The pups, the ones they are picking up, are acting just like they do. Here Robb smiled as he passed a direwolf pup to Bran and picked up his own, the one whose fur was as grey as a stormy night, holding him with a firm but gentle grasp, to make sure nothing went wrong. Bran grinned widely as Goldwing perched upon the battlements, holding the little pup close to his heart. Winter, he said with a smile as he named his pup, the first of any of her children them to do so. And I must name my own direwolf, sometime, perhaps for my own mother, she would have loved nothing more than to see her grandchildren as I see them now. Father. Jon spoke with a quiet and hopeful tone. Can he swallowed any discomfort he might have had? Can I hold that one? I know he is Rakan's, but I will never have a wolf of my own. I only hope to know what it might feel like. Her husband gave his bastard a sad smile and an understanding nod. Of course. Ned slowly walked towards John, but then the bastard looked away from him, his gaze going towards something that the Schwulf had heard but no one else had. He walked over as the Schwulf did, and she dipped her head into the snows and rose again with a little direwolf held between her teeth, the little pup having been the first to be born and the first to wander off whilst her mother was still birthing all the others. Then she dropped him on the ground and continued on her way, ignoring him completely and following Caitlin, not even stopping to let him feed or nuzzle against her, the sight sending chills down her spine to see. She doesn't care for that pup, mother have mercy, is that the way that I act to John? John crouched down beside the rejected puppy and hoisted him up into his arms, holding him close to his body to warm him and gently rocking him to encourage him to move and wiggle on his own. He was even smaller than Sansa's pup, as white as the snow he had been buried in, wiggling weakly in John's arms and completely silent. And his eyes were open, as bright a red as the shiniest of rubies. It would seem we're both bastards, John said to his pup before turning to his father. I'll feed him by bottle and look after him myself, if his mother won't. She looked towards the Schwulf as she sat on the floor, waiting. We are the same as each other, we're both mothers, and we both abandoned a child who needed us. The thought made bile rise in her throat and caused her stomach to turn. She had never once been a mother to John, she had never carried him inside her womb or birthed him into the world, he had none of her